I thought we were happy. I thought we were in love. But that was before I found the pictures, before I saw the truth. They say ignorance is bliss, but what they don't tell you is that knowledge destroys. I wasn't prepared for the betrayal, the lies, the cold realization that the woman I vowed to love had sold her soul for cheap thrills. And now, as I stand by the river, watching the car sink with her lover inside, I realize love doesn't die in a moment. It dies slowly, in silence, in secrets. And today, I buried mine. The week before Christmas, Steve Curtis wore a smile on his face, but he didn't really feel happy. He had come to the party with his wife, Barbara, hoping that things between them would get better. They had been distant for a few months, and he still didn't know why. Tonight was supposed to be a pleasant evening with Barbara's co-workers and friends. Steve had met a few of them at other events, and he thought it would be a good chance to connect more. Instead, his smile felt forced. As soon as they arrived, Barbara's boss's nephew rushed to their table. He took a chair from another table and squeezed in next to Barbara. This annoyed Steve and another man who had to shift his chair to make space. Worse than that, Jimmy, as Barbara called him, was trying hard to get all of Barbara's attention. To Steve's surprise, Barbara seemed to enjoy it, soaking up every compliment Jimmy threw her way. Jimmy and Barbara laughed together, leaning closer as they shared a joke. Seeing this, Steve stopped pretending. He let his smile fade. Out of the 9 people at the table, only Barbara and Jimmy were still laughing. Steve cleared his throat and showed his frustration. Jimmy looked over at Steve and grinned widely. "Hey, Stevie, relax a bit. It was just a joke," he said. Barbara turned to her husband. "Steve," she said softly, "don't take it too seriously. Jimmy was just making a point about people. Come on." "Right," Jimmy added. "What she said." His laughter filled the room, soon joined by Barbara's giggles. "Actually," Jimmy joked, "I didn't think you'd get a joke like that. No offense, but it's just a bit too complicated for construction workers," he said with a pleased smile, looking at everyone for support. Barbara chuckled once more and shot Steve a look of annoyance. Steve struggled to keep his anger down. It wasn't easy. He took a moment to slouch back in his chair and tried to calm down. He fiddled with his wine glass instead of letting his hands reach for Jimmy's neck. "The point he was making, dear, and calling me an idiot too, is that there are people who can't afford to buy big houses or rent fancy apartments in the good part of town. Jimmy thinks those people are lazy and deserve to be mocked." Steve's anger boiled over. "Well, I live in a mobile home," Steve continued slowly but firmly. This tone was a sign to those who knew him. When Steve spoke softly, it was a warning. They knew he was serious. "On construction sites, we use trailers for offices and workspaces. Many of the workers and their families live in mobile homes because they can't afford anything else. They want what people call the American dream. They wish for their own homes, but things are tough, and it's always been that way. They haven't saved enough for a down payment on a bigger house. And they didn't have a rich uncle either," he added, his scorn clear. Jimmy stared at Steve, shocked. His uncle owned the company, and no one usually spoke to Jimmy like that. He looked furious. "As for me," Steve said, "I would never mock hard-working men and women who are doing their best. I can't respect myself if I did that." With that, he looked right into Jimmy's eyes, showing his anger. He hoped Jimmy would feel insulted. 2 other husbands at the table shifted closer, ready to step in if necessary. Jimmy, looking pale, started to stand up. Though he worked out often, he didn't know the difference between gym muscles and those from actual hard work. He was about to find out. "I agree with you, young man," boomed a voice from behind. Steve turned to see a short, balding man in an expensive suit standing next to him. Though he was older, he stood tall and straight. "I was born while my parents lived in a small trailer, and some of my happiest memories are from that time," the man said firmly, staring at Jimmy, who looked uneasy as he sat back down. "Jonas Reynolds," the older man introduced himself. He reached out his hand to Steve. They shook hands firmly but kindly. Steve liked that. Many men tried to make it a challenge, and though he usually won, he didn't enjoy it. "Steve Curtis," he replied, introducing himself. Reynolds nodded. "And this is your wife, the lovely Barbara?" he asked, extending his hand to Barbara. She didn't get up because there wasn't enough space to pull her chair back without bumping into Jonas, which made her feel shy as she turned a little. Steve was starting to feel uneasy about Jimmy. He was worried because his wife worked for Reynolds and Sons, and he guessed that the man beside him was Mr. Reynolds. He hoped his earlier reactions wouldn't affect Barbara's job. He looked at her just in time to see a flash of frustration in her eyes before she looked away. "Jimmy," Mr. Reynolds said softly, "I think you should go find your Aunt Jenny and see if she needs anything." Jimmy's face changed, showing he was upset and wanted to argue. "Now, Jimmy." Jonas Reynolds' voice was firm. Jimmy stood up, pushing his chair back loudly, and turned away, his ears turning red as he walked to the opposite side of the room. Everyone at the table watched him go. "I'm afraid Jimmy won't be here much longer," Jonas said. "Family is important, but sometimes things don't work out," he added with a thoughtful look. He reached out his hand to Steve again. This time, Steve stood up. Standing a bit over 6 feet tall, he towered over the smaller CEO. "I hope you won't think all of the Reynolds are like one rude kid," Jonas said. "Barbara is an important part of our team, and we wouldn't want to lose her because of Jimmy's actions," he added, glancing at Barbara carefully. His face was calm, unreadable. Jonas turned to see the other guests around the table. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to interrupt your party. Please enjoy your evening." He smiled warmly, touched Steve's arm gently, and quietly walked away. It took a few minutes, but soon the conversation around the table picked up again, becoming lighter with more laughter. The men shook Steve's hand before the party wrapped up. 2 of the women patted Steve on the shoulder as they passed by him, going to the restroom. One even touched his cheek and smiled kindly. Nobody said anything about how Barbara was quiet for the rest of the evening. Jimmy didn't come back at all. The quiet lasted until they got home. Once the front door closed behind them, Barbara's frustration spilled out. "You had to embarrass me in front of my friends, didn't you?" she said angrily. "You keep putting down my friends every chance you get. That tough guy act you pulled with Jimmy, why do you have to do that? Jimmy is a good person. He didn't deserve that." Steve looked at her in surprise. After a moment, his shock turned to anger. "Excuse me?" he said. "You were the one making a fool of yourself. I just watched you act that way. What did you think you were doing? You were laughing and flirting with him." Barbara was shocked. Steve rarely fought back like this. When he did, it meant he really cared. She usually lost when he stood firm. He was just trying to talk," she said, feeling defensive. "Why do you have to be so cruel? Jimmy is just a nice guy who tries to talk to me sometimes. What's wrong with that? Is there something wrong with having friends?" "Not at all," Steve replied, "until it gets to where you ignore your husband all night or you're getting too close to a guy everyone notices." He glared at her for a moment. "What were you going to do next? Climb into his lap? You were close enough." Barbara's face turned pale, then flushed red in an instant. "Well, maybe I would," she said sarcastically. "Maybe next time I will sit on his lap. Jimmy knows how to treat a woman right. He's not just some construction worker." Steve's jaw tightened as he stared at her. Suddenly he felt like he didn't know her anymore. "Barbara," he said softly, "you sat here tonight and let another man disrespect me right in front of you. You laughed with him. Everyone saw it. I stayed calm because I was thinking of you. Any other time I would have called Jimmy out for that." He walked slowly toward her as she stood in the hall. "But if I did that," he said slowly, "it wouldn't have been fair to him, would it?" Barbara looked at him, confused. "Barbara," he said gently, "if I reacted strongly to what he said, I would have had to think about what you did too, wouldn't I? After all, it was both of you disrespecting me, wasn't it?" He studied her for a long moment. Neither of them spoke. "But we both know I couldn't do that, right?" he said. "My dad taught me that a man should never disrespect a woman." They both stayed silent. The quiet felt strange between them. "Barbara?" Steve asked quietly. "Do you want a divorce?" Barbara's eyes grew wide. No. That's too much, isn't it?" She hesitated, then got her thoughts together. She spoke slowly and firmly and waited for her husband to reply. He kept looking at her with a serious expression. "Listen," he said firmly. Next time you take another man's side against me like you did tonight. Next time you laugh when someone insults me, or act like someone else matters more than me. That's the day I'll think about ending this marriage. Believe me, Barbara, it will happen. Barbara turned sharply and walked down the hall. Steve followed slowly, feeling tired. He had been so excited for the evening. Now all those hopes were shattered, and he felt more let down than he had in a long time. The bedroom door slammed shut, echoing in the quiet house. When he reached the door, Steve tried the knob and found it locked. He had expected this. He thought about grabbing a blanket and pillow from the hall closet to sleep on the couch. At least he could turn on the Christmas tree lights. They looked nice and would bring him some comfort for the night. Suddenly, his earlier frustration flared up again. Without thinking, he pressed his back against the wall opposite the door, took a quick step, and pushed the door hard. It burst open and hit the wall, surprising his wife. Barbara stepped back, instinctively putting her arms up in a defensive way. Steve, after pushing the door aside, looked at Barbara in shock. "What's wrong with you?" he asked. "If I didn't hurt you earlier, I'm not going to do anything now." He walked to the closet and started changing, carefully hanging his suit coat and pants where they belonged. "I don't want to sleep with you," Barbara said, her voice shaky. Steve scoffed. "Fine, but I didn't do anything wrong. You did. If you don't want to sleep with me, that's your choice. But I'm sleeping in my own bed tonight. If you don't want to, the spare sheets and blankets are in the closet." Barbara stayed quiet. After a while, Steve went back to getting ready for bed. He ignored her standing by the door. When she slipped past him and left the room, he didn't try to stop her. It felt lonely in bed without her. It took a long time for him to calm down enough to sleep. Before dawn, he woke up when Barbara got into bed. She stayed as far away from him as she could. He turned away from her and fell asleep almost instantly. Chapter 1. Mid-June. People can find out about cheaters in many ways. Sometimes it's an overheard phone call, an email left open, or text messages not erased from a phone. A friend or family member might catch the cheating spouse with someone else, or a lover might get caught if a spouse comes home early. It can even happen if they talk in their sleep. There are countless ways for someone to discover an affair. For example, Steve Curtis found out about his wife's cheating in the newspaper. He didn't usually read the newspaper. He preferred getting news online or from TV. His brother John, who worked at the local Fox TV station, couldn't understand why Steve wouldn't just watch the news. But a man can do anything to distract himself in a dentist's waiting room. He'll read magazines, count tiles on the ceiling, or even grab an old newspaper if he needs to. When Steve finally picked up a newspaper, he skipped to the sports section and avoided the society news. However, he didn't mind reading the ads. He even found one for a bass boat that caught his interest and wrote down the phone number to call later. The sound of the dentist's drill got louder. He hoped it was just the drill. Steve needed something to do. Unwillingly, he picked up the section marked with a big C at the top. On the first page, he saw pictures from a social event at the home of a local wealthy family. The first picture didn't impress him. It just made the host look heavier than he probably was. In the next picture, Steve saw his wife walking away from the camera, smiling at a man beside her. His jaw tightened from rising anger as he looked closer. There was another issue, something serious. The man's arm was positioned in a way that looked wrong. It seemed like the picture had been altered. If it hadn't been cropped, the man's hand might have been in an inappropriate spot. His wife's smile made it clear she was enjoying herself. Steve's heart sank. Suddenly, he felt a heavy darkness he had never known. He went numb. His hands felt lifeless. The newspaper slipped from his fingers. Everything around him blurred as tears filled his eyes. He couldn't think at all. His mind felt gone. All he could see was the part of the room right in front of him. He felt tightness in his chest as he moved like a robot. The dental assistant called his name, bringing him back to reality. He walked into the room, smiled at something she said, then sat down and waited quietly while she tied a paper bib around his neck. He looked alert and went along with everything the clinic staff did, but deep down he wasn't really present. This dental filling was the least painful he'd ever experienced. He truly didn't feel anything. When Dr. Willis sat him up straight again, it was clear he was feeling a heavy worry inside him that wouldn't go away. He moved like a robot to the elevator and pressed the button for the parking garage, but he couldn't remember where he had parked his truck. He walked around every level, looking at each row of cars until he finally spotted it. He sat in the big black Ram Charger, not moving or thinking, until he found the energy to start the engine. When the motor roared to life, it was a loud noise that echoed off the concrete walls and down the hallways. The previous owner had ruined the engine in this 5-year-old truck. He had replaced it with a bigger and more powerful one, then made it even stronger. Just before he finished working on it, the man had a serious stroke. Steve got the truck for a low price because the man's wife wanted to sell it fast. She didn't want anything that reminded her of her late husband. In the rearview mirror, he saw an angry man getting into a fancy car across the aisle. The man threw a sign of annoyance at Steve before driving away. Realizing he was still stepping on the gas, he had to force himself to lift his foot. Everything felt so hard now. His life had changed drastically. He felt lost in a sea of sadness and frustration. He had sensed something was wrong. The Christmas party had been a warning sign, but he had noticed Barbara pulling away before that. After the party and a big fight, Steve tried even harder to show his love for her. He left little gifts, like a small bottle of her favorite perfume on the dashboard of her car. He sent flowers to her office during a tough work week. He even sent her sweet e-cards to remind her of his love. He did everything he could think of to bridge the gap between them, but nothing worked. Things improved a bit around Valentine's Day. Barbara came to him, sorry for her coldness and regretting how she acted at the party. They had a month of warmth in their marriage again. He started doing his homework for school while sitting in class, half listening to the professor explain things to the slower students. He had a few more classes to finish before getting his degree in architectural engineering, which he needed for a promotion. Then, at the end of March, he had to go to Washington for work. It was supposed to be a short trip, just a little over a week, but he got stuck in Little Rock on the way back. He ended up being gone for 3 weeks. When he returned, Barbara seemed completely uninterested in fixing their relationship. If they had been cold before, they were now frozen. She looked tired and didn't want to do much except sleep. She avoided him, acting like they were distant. The connection they had just begun to rebuild vanished when he came back. Steve tried everything he could think of to understand what was wrong, but nothing worked. One day, after sending her a funny email card, Barbara replied sharply, saying she was tired of his controlling ways and wanted space. With everything that had happened in the past months, he worried she might be seeing someone else. But seeing real proof was still shocking. He needed more details. A blurry photo in a newspaper wasn't real proof. He had to see the full picture to understand what it meant. "John," he said into his cell phone. He was driving around aimlessly, not wanting to go home. Barbara would be there soon. At least he thought so. He didn't know anymore. Was she out with that other person right now? "Hey, Steve!" John said loudly. John always talked too loud on the phone. He seemed to think if he didn't shout, Steve wouldn't hear him. So, Steve turned down the volume again. John was older by 14 months and never let him forget it. Today, his voice was comforting. "John?" Steve's voice cracked. He felt like crying before he could stop it. John noticed right away. "Steve, what's wrong?" John asked quickly. Suddenly, the background noise of the busy office faded a lot. John must have closed his office door, which he rarely did. I think Barbara is cheating on me," Steve admitted. He took a deep breath while listening to John express his own frustration. Talking to John made Steve feel a bit better. The swearing didn't really help, but it felt good to know that his brother stood by him no matter what would happen next. "What can I do?" John asked when he ran out of things to say. "There's a picture in Sunday's Observer," Steve told him. "I need to see the whole thing, not just the parts that fit in a tiny space. Can you think of any way to get a good copy for me?" John paused for a moment. "Yes, Steve," he finally answered. "I know a guy there who owes me a lot. He wouldn't have his job without my help. Let me ask him and see what I can find, okay?" Steve felt a bit of relief. Someone was on his side. He told John where to find the picture in the old newspaper. John said it didn't matter how old it was because newspapers keep digital copies forever. His friend would easily find the edition he needed. There was a good chance the picture was also in digital format. Many photographers used modern digital cameras that took high-quality images. John would check and get back to Steve. Steve thanked him and ended the call. Seeing and talking to Barbara during those first nights had been hard. As a warm man with his family, Steve found it tough to be close to his wife for the first time since they got married. On Friday, John brought a large, thin envelope to the construction site and handed it to Steve in the office trailer. John looked happy to be inside. The thin walls of the trailer felt comforting. There were too many loud vehicles outside that made it hard for him to relax. He was glad to be in a safe place with Steve. Steve gave his brother a small smile. Seeing John's sweaty forehead and nervous chatter brought a little joy to a sad day. Steve walked John back to his Volvo, thanking him with each step. John shook Steve's hand at the sidewalk's edge and asked him to come over for dinner soon, as in, very soon. After night fell, everything was quiet. Only Steve and 3 security guards were still around. Steve had a large .45 gun in a holster on his desk. He would clip it to his belt when it was time to leave. Construction sites could be dangerous at night. There were always people looking for a place to hide and petty thieves wanting to steal materials. After a couple of workers had been attacked in the past, Steve got a permit to carry and started to go armed most of the time. After John left, the afternoon had been busy, and Steve hadn't had a chance to look through the packet his brother brought. He reluctantly opened the big envelope. Inside were 3 photos from a party at the mansion. Barbara was in each one, but she was never the main focus. The first was an unedited picture that had been cut for the newspaper. The 8x10 print was clear and sharp. Steve took a magnifying glass from his desk to see the details. In this photo, a man was pulling Barbara closer. Steve gritted his teeth and had to force himself to relax. He had been warned by the dentist about doing that. Trying hard not to tear the photo, he set it aside and looked at the next one. In this one, Barbara and the man stood on the grass, each holding a champagne glass. Barbara had her arm around the man's waist. His left hand was resting on her back. Steve felt his jaw tighten again and set this photo on top of the first. The third photo showed Barbara and the man sitting at a table looking at each other. The man was leaning closer to Barbara, and her face showed excitement. Steve felt his anger rise as he noticed the man's hand on the inside of Barbara's skirt. He wondered how far up that man had gone after the picture was taken. Ah! He let out a scream. It felt better, but he knew he couldn't lose control. The guards were on their rounds, and no one could hear him in the office trailer. He wished he could hit something. The walls felt too weak. He forced himself to stay calm. Slowly, he turned the anger inward. His intense feelings began to cool. He closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. He tried to relax his fingers and all his muscles one by one. In time, the upset feeling in his stomach calmed. He could think clearly again. From how Barbara accepted the man's closeness in the photos, it seemed this affair had been going on for a while. Or the man moved very quickly and Barbara was willing. Either way, Barbara was doing things a married woman shouldn't do. The pain inside him was strong. It quickly turned to anger again, and it took time to calm down. He didn't understand why Barbara was doing this, but it was not something he could ignore. There was nothing left to do but let go and face the end of their marriage through the courts. He planned to call a lawyer the next day. Just then, his phone vibrated in his pocket, surprising him. He wasn't expecting a phone call. "Hey," John said when Steve picked up. "Hi, John," Steve answered. "What's going on?" "Can you talk?" "Sure, but I'm still at work," Steve replied. "Yeah," John said. His voice sounded kind. He understood why Steve wasn't home. "Anyway, I heard from my contact at the newspaper," John said. "He showed some pictures to a friend and found out who this guy is." "Do you have something to write with?" Steve grabbed a pen from his shirt pocket. His heart raced. Knowing who Barbara's other man was didn't mean much. It wouldn't change anything, but it felt like he was making progress. He wasn't just sitting by anymore. "Yeah, I'm ready," Steve said. He could hear his brother taking a deep breath. "Okay, the guy's name is Raphael Leland Porter. His mom is Hispanic and his dad is Anglo. That's why he has that name. He goes by Rafe. Did you get that?" "Hang on," Steve said. He couldn't write fast enough. "Okay, go on. What else?" "Well, he's an executive at Harper Insurance. He's not at the top, but he's moving up." When Steve heard that, he decided he wanted to do something about it. He knew Barbara was making her own choices and he blamed her for their marriage problems. But he didn't want the guy to get away without any consequences. John had stopped talking. He understood Steve was probably thinking of ways to make things hard for Raphael Porter. "Okay, I got that," Steve finally said. "Anything else?" Yes, there was more. John's friend had the man's whole public record. Raphael was married to Elaine Jeanette Porter. They had been married for 8 years and had a 6-year-old daughter named Rachel Marie. Elaine worked as a sales manager at a fancy downtown store. She wanted to keep busy, but the couple didn't really need her income. Rafe liked to mix with important people in the insurance field and local government. There were rumors he might want to go into politics, but he hadn't done anything about it yet. After Steve noted all this information, he thanked John and ended the call. This wasn't everything he wanted to know about the man with Barbara, but it was a great start. He had an idea of how to find out more. Private investigators come in many types. Some are like the characters in TV shows who chase excitement. They get flashy ID cards, buy handcuffs and cameras, and sometimes even a gun. With almost no rules in the field, that's often all they need. Then there are former soldiers and cops who want to use their experience to be investigators. They focus so much on their goals that they might forget to think about how their past jobs really qualify them for this new work. At the top are the true professionals. They are often skeptical of the TV-style private eyes and look down on retired workers from other fields. These investigators usually gather experience as police detectives or in military investigations. A few even grow up learning from top practitioners in investigation agencies. The head of security for the company Steve worked for had been in the Department of State's VIP Protection Service. He had retired after a job in Baghdad but felt good about his new job, which paid better and made him happier. He also knew many law enforcement people who were familiar with the area. With recommendations from the security chief, Steve made a list of good private investigation agencies. Many offered various services, but he focused on 2 that specialized in electronic surveillance. He picked one that could see him right away. When he got there, he was glad to see the office looked like any normal business. Soft music played in the background. Workers were busy at their desks. He heard conversations filled with terms he didn't understand, which made him wish he'd brought the security chief to help explain everything. The first meeting went well. The woman he spoke with, a skilled detective with many awards on her wall, asked detailed questions. She had even prepared a list of what he wanted her to investigate. "Mr. Curtis," she said after looking at her notes, "most of this information you could get from public records at the courthouse or from a reverse street address directory at a public library. Did you know that?" Steve admitted that some of what he wanted could come from courthouse records, though he didn't know about the directory she mentioned. He brought it up because he wanted to learn who lived at the Porter house, their phone numbers, and email addresses. He shrugged. "I guess I could," he said, "but I also want to know more that I doubt would be public information, and I can pay you to create a nice, professional report for me." That was true. After Barbara opened her own checking account in early May, Steve shut down their joint account and got one for himself. This led to a fight because Steve expected Barbara to keep paying her part of the bills. For some reason, she thought Steve would manage the old account alone. This was just one of many misunderstandings they had during the last 6 months. But it stuck in Steve's mind. For the past few months, Steve had been putting all his paycheck and 2 bonus checks, which Barbara didn't know about, into an account that Barbara couldn't access. He could easily afford to hire someone for work he could do himself. The investigator nodded. She knew she had to explain his options, but she and her partner were in business to make money. They were happy to take care of this for him. 2 days later, Steve had the phone numbers for Mr. Raphael Porter and Mrs. Porter, as well as their bosses' numbers. A few workers from those businesses, and the company where Barbara worked, shared all the email addresses they had for some money. After looking at a few email address books, the agency was pretty sure they had almost all the home and work email addresses for everyone at the companies where Barbara and the Porters worked. He got information about the license plates and descriptions of the 3 cars the Porters owned, their home address, and where they worked. There was also a lot of other information that might be useful one day. Much of this information came from public records. Some of it probably shouldn't have been shared with people outside those companies, but it wasn't illegal to send emails or have the addresses. The report was a 3-inch binder, and it took him 2 more days to go through it all. He took those days off and went to the library to read. The new building project was going well, and the workers were organized enough that he could spare the time. He looked at the pictures and details until he felt he understood everything well. As he worked, his dull anger sometimes flared into frustration. He always calmed himself down before getting too angry. He wanted to show Barbara what he found. He imagined her surprise. He couldn't wait to see her reaction when he proved he wasn't as clueless as she thought. Steve was on his way to Barbara's office. It was almost lunchtime, and he thought he'd ask her to join him. It was time to let her know that he knew the truth. As he pulled into the parking lot, he saw a shiny Ford Thunderbird leaving. Steve knew Mr. Porter drove a new Thunderbird. This one was the same silver color. It felt like too much of a coincidence. He quickly drove through the lot to chase after it. He caught up in just a few moments. It wasn't hard, though it made his heart race as he ran 2 red lights and weaved around slower cars. When he saw the Thunderbird in the fast lane ahead, he slowed down to keep pace for a bit. He needed to be sure. At the next red light, Steve took out his camcorder and used it to check the people in the car. It was Barbara. There was no mistake. He let the camera run until the light turned green. Just before the Thunderbird took off, she smiled and waved at the man beside her. He moved closer in traffic, parking a few cars behind them in the next lane. Most people don't usually look for someone following them, and Mr. Porter was one of them. He and Barbara didn't seem to notice they should be checking their surroundings. The Thunderbird parked in a city park by the river, near some trees that blocked them from view. Steve parked his pickup behind a low storage building. He had to strain to see over it, but managed to hold up the camcorder and start recording, checking the focus every now and then to keep both people in the frame. He watched Barbara and Mr. Porter talk casually. He noticed her toss something light and white onto the dashboard after a moment. Suddenly, Steve's anger boiled over. He started the engine and shifted into low gear. He drove around the building and got close to the Thunderbird in no time. He didn't know what he would do, but he felt he had to act. He didn't think about a plan or the possible outcomes. When he parked behind the car, he knew he had to confront them. He hit the brakes hard, but didn't stop fully. His pickup was much tougher than the small Thunderbird. The pickup truck's bumper quickly hit the other car. The thin metal of the Thunderbird's trunk crumpled as Steve moved forward. He switched the truck into 4-wheel drive, stepped on the gas, and began pushing the smaller car down the small hill into the slow-moving stream. The strong engine had no trouble pushing the silver coupe with its 2 passengers into the water. Steve could hear their loud screams over the noise of the engine. For the first time in a week, he smiled, but it was not a nice smile. He didn't stop until the water was nearly up to the side of the Thunderbird. With one last bump, he eased off the gas, put the truck in reverse, and backed out of the river casually. Once all 4 tires were back on dry land, he stopped and shifted out of 4-wheel drive. He put the truck in park and turned off the engine. He propped the camcorder on the dashboard with a rag from the floor so it would focus on the sinking Thunderbird. Then, he stepped out of the pickup to see what he had done. Walking back to the edge of the water, he watched the 2 people still moving wildly inside the small car. After a few moments, Barbara and Porter crawled out of the open windows and fell into the water. They came up, coughing up water and wiping mud from their eyes. Steve could hear Mr. Raphael Porter shouting something, but he didn't care to listen. Steve focused on his wife. He saw her looking up at him. When she realized it was him, she stumbled back and fell into a hole in the riverbed. When she surfaced again, she looked almost frantic. "Rafe!" she yelled. "Oh God, it's my husband!" Steve took that as a warning for her friend, assuming the same figure she called out already knew who he was. Raphael Porter was walking towards Steve, swearing with each step. "He's got a gun!" Barbara yelled. When he heard Barbara's shout, Rafe stopped and moved back a few steps. Steve's hand went to the grip of his gun, tucked away on his right side. It was just part of his everyday life. He hadn't thought about carrying a gun in years. He snorted in annoyance. If he had wanted to use it on the 2, he would have already done it. He looked at them. Both soaked and muddy, they were a sorry sight. Suddenly, his anger turned into disgust. They were involved in something wrong and upsetting. It was fitting they were covered in muck. It was quiet now. The soft sound of the water flowing was broken only by the popping from the pickup's cooling engine. "Barbara!" Steve said. His first word made her jump, even though he wasn't loud. His face was blank. "Barbara!" he called again. "What?" she asked, unsure of what to say. "Don't come home," Steve said clearly. "Go to your parents or something, but stay away from me. Understand?" Barbara nodded. Frightened and wet, she began to realize that her affair was over, and it had ended suddenly. The harsh truth was sinking in. Steve looked at her a moment longer, disgust clear on his face. He turned to her companion. "Mr. Porter," he said loud enough for the man to hear. Steve wanted him to know that he recognized who he was. "You can call the cops if you want," Steve told him. "They'll take me away. But you won't like what happens when I get out. I promise you that." Raphael Porter listened, feeling fear for the first time in years. He didn't say anything. Even though Steve's hand was no longer on his gun, he couldn't stop looking at it. Steve walked back to his pickup. He took one last look at the two wet and muddy people, his face showing contempt. He closed the door, started the truck, and drove away from the scene. Barbara came to her senses and started yelling for him to come back. Steve saw her. He heard her calls, but just shook his head and kept going. He didn't care how she would get to her parents. His life with her was over. She was someone else's problem now. Chapter 2. Third week of June. For the rest of the week, Steve expected a police car to stop him every time he got into the pickup and went somewhere. By the second day, when no one knocked on his door at night and no cops came to the site to take him away, he began to feel a little better. Despite his harsh words to Barbara's friend, he knew he had no real defense against any claims the district attorney might make. While he waited, he visited a lawyer his brother had suggested. John said the woman was tough in court. She had just helped a friend of John win custody of his 3 kids. Steve didn't need more than a simple divorce, but he thought it was best to have someone fierce on his side. It matched his mood perfectly. By noon on Friday, the locks were changed. Most of Barbara's clothes were packed into boxes, and her personal things were in smaller boxes. He hadn't spent much time on it. He swept everything off the shelves and out of the drawers and tossed it all into boxes. He taped them up and stacked them in the garage. They would stay there until his soon-to-be ex-wife came to pick them up. He kept finding things around the house that he had forgotten to pack. Finally, he decided to leave one box open so he could toss new items inside whenever he walked by. When Saturday arrived and he was still free, he thought that the guy who had been with Barbara probably hadn't told the police. Barbara had called him several times over the last 3 days, but Steve didn't answer. If her name came up on the caller ID or the call came from his in-laws, he ignored it. He knew that must be making Barbara mad. He didn't care. This time, when the phone rang, it showed it was his father-in-law's cell phone. On a whim, Steve decided it was time to answer. "Hello, Lloyd," he said softly. There was a moment of silence on the other end. Steve?" Barbara's dad had not expected Steve to pick up. "Yeah, what do you need?" Steve asked. Steve, I'm really sorry about what's going on with you and Barbara. We were hoping you could come over and talk about it. We care about you and don't want this to get worse," Lloyd said. He sounded a bit desperate. Steve paused for a while. He thought about hanging up on Lloyd. If he turned the phone down, the call would end. He was tempted to do that. "Steve," Lloyd said after a bit. "Yes." "Well, Lloyd, I'll be honest with you. From some things I heard Diane say about me while Barb and I were dating, and after we married, I'm not sure how you can think so well of me. But I'll let that go for now. Barb and I aren't misunderstanding anything, Lloyd. I caught her cheating, and I'm not going to ignore it." He stayed quiet after that, waiting for Lloyd to say something. "Okay, so, Steve, can you come and talk to us? I promise we won't judge you. We just want to fix this, okay?" There was urgency in Lloyd's voice. Steve guessed he was feeling a lot of stress. "No," Steve replied firmly. He paused again. "But if you want to come here, I'll be around for the next hour," he told his father-in-law. Steve could hear murmurs in the background. "Okay, Steve, we'll come over," Lloyd finally said. "We'll be there soon." "Fine," Steve said. "Hey, bring the van, all right? Barbara has a lot of things to pick up." Okay, we'll bring the van," Lloyd replied quickly. He didn't want to start another conversation. "We'll be there in a few minutes." He kept his face neutral as his in-laws and wife walked in. Barbara looked around, noticing every little change Steve had made in the week. Her lips tightened at each missing picture or trinket. Steve shook his father-in-law's hand and nodded to Diane. He wasn't close to his mother-in-law, and she knew why. He felt no warmth for Barbara. The only person he was glad to see was a surprise. He hadn't expected Barbara's grandmother, whom she called Noni, to be there. "Hello, Lydia," he said with a smile. "I didn't know you were coming." He greeted her with genuine warmth. Steve had always liked Lydia. When Diane and her husband disapproved of Barbara's choices, Lydia had always supported him. She offered her cheek for a quick kiss, and he gave her one in return. Steve glanced outside, wondering if another member of Barbara's family was outside. "Is Kimberly coming?" he asked. Lloyd shook his head. "She's still at her college prep course in Austin," he said. "I wouldn't have brought her anyway. I don't think this is something she needs to be part of, do you?" Steve shrugged. "I'm not sure you need to be part of this either, Lloyd," he said kindly. He agreed with his father-in-law, though. Kimberly had just graduated high school in June. Her grades weren't the best, so she was taking a short course to prepare for college. Kim was a pretty girl, fun to be around and outgoing. She had been a cheerleader all 3 years in high school and part of the popular groups, but she had just turned 18 in January and could be a bit scatterbrained. Steve wouldn't want her in this talk either. Barbara and her parents sat on the couch. Lydia made herself comfortable on the love seat and crossed her legs. She spotted Steve watching her and smiled. He had once told her she had nice legs for her age, and she remembered it. She adjusted her legs and relaxed into the cushions. Steve settled into the lazy boy and turned to face the three on the couch. He waited for someone to speak. He watched Barbara. She shifted back and forth, a bit uneasy under his gaze. Steve looked at her, wondering who this woman really was. He had married her after dating on and off for 2 years. They had broken up for almost 6 months after a fight about being exclusive. They had now been married for 4 years, so he had known Barbara for 6 years. No, that wasn't right. He didn't really know her. He didn't understand why she would betray him. He decided he didn't know her at all. He looked her over, trying to see her like a stranger. She was attractive, that was true, but over the past few years she had grown into a tall, slender woman. Her long legs were fit. She had brown hair and green eyes. Sometimes, in the right light, he saw a hint of red in her hair. She was Irish on her dad's side. It was no surprise that some of those looks showed up in the family. It suited her well. She had a few freckles on her nose and cheeks. Her appearance caught the eye but wasn't overly striking. Barbara's beauty didn't come from just one thing. It was a mix of everything about her. Her long strides, lovely smile, bright eyes. It was all those things he loved. He corrected himself. He had loved her. That love had been fading for a long time, and he wasn't sure how much was left. He turned away from Barbara and focused on his father-in-law. Steve raised his eyebrows, inviting him to start. It was best to get this meeting over with and move on. Steve, Lloyd spoke awkwardly. Barbara told us about you seeing her and Mr. Porter at the park. We think you might have gotten the wrong idea about what was happening there. Steve glanced at Barbara. She was sitting up straight instead of leaning back. "Okay," Steve said. "What were you doing with Mr. Raphael Porter?" he asked her. "Or, what did you tell your parents you were doing?" "I told them the truth," Barbara shot back. She looked like she was struggling to keep her anger in check. Steve smiled softly, though his eyes didn't show the same warmth. He waved for her to go on. Barbara took a deep breath. "I'm sorry you misunderstood, Steve," she said. "It's really simple, and you shouldn't have reacted the way you did." Steve raised his hand to stop her. Barbara looked confused. "Don't call me that," Steve said firmly. "You lost the right to do that. I won't accept it." Barbara's lips tightened and her eyes flashed with anger. She worked to control herself and nodded. "Whatever you say," she said in a calm voice, wanting to keep the peace. She sat back, hands folded in her lap. "Anyway, what you saw was innocent. Rafe has been having trouble in his marriage, and I've been helping him through it. We talk, and it seems to help him to hear a woman's point of view. That's all it is. Steve, Rafe is just a good friend. I get why you were upset when you saw us at the river, but that's it." She finished her explanation with a tentative smile. Steve looked at her silently for a long time. Her story sounded rehearsed to him. "How did you meet Mr. Porter?" he finally asked. Barbara's eyes narrowed. She hadn't prepared for that question. "Before you answer," Steve added, "I will only accept the truth. If you want to save this marriage, and I assume you do, then don't lie about anything. Do you understand, Barbara?" After a moment, she nodded. Steve raised his hand, inviting her to continue. "He works in the same building as me," Barbara said. "We met in the cafeteria downstairs and just started talking one day." She added, "Actually, you'd like him if you weren't always so upset." Steve chose not to respond to that. He couldn't help but feel a bit mocking. He took a deep breath to calm down. "So you met at the restaurant in the lobby of your building and you've been helping him with his marriage, right?" Steve asked. Barbara nodded. "And there was no affair?" he asked. She shook her head. "No," she replied. "Was there any inappropriate behavior?" Steve asked in a calm tone. "No," Barbara replied firmly. Steve continued to look at her quietly for a long time. Her dad coughed to break the tension. "So, Steve, you see how you might have misunderstood what Barbara was doing, right? I'm not saying she should have been helping him without telling you, but it wasn't what you thought," he added. Steve looked at Barbara's father. He felt a bit sorry for the man. Steve shook his head. He reached for the magazine rack and pulled out a thick binder, flipping through it for a moment. "I guess you all forgot my brother John is the news director at the Fox station," he said absent-mindedly. "People with high-profile lives have files at news organizations. Some information is out there for the public." He looked at Barbara. She was no longer leaning back on the couch. She sat up straight, looking very anxious. "And also, I hired a private investigator. This is their report," Steve said, nodding at the binder in his lap. Barbara's eyes widened and her anxiety grew. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. "Mr. Raphael Porter is a well-known manager at Harper Insurance," Steve continued. "He's generally respected, but his career has faced some issues lately. A few bad investments he suggested didn't work out, but he might turn things around with some effort. He could take a job at their regional office next summer." Steve skimmed through more pages. "Oh, here's something interesting. His office is in the Lowry building downtown. I checked on MapQuest. It's over 13 miles from where you work, Barbara," he said quietly. "That's quite a distance to drive at lunchtime just to meet in the lobby restaurant, isn't it? Is it really worth driving so far for a 1-hour lunch just to help him with his marriage?" Steve acted like he was reading something important on the page. He tried to ignore the 4 people across the room, but he did notice his father-in-law looking worried and his mother-in-law looking puzzled. Barbara looked more and more anxious. Barbara's grandmother clearly didn't like what she was hearing. "Barbara, dear," Lydia said in a disapproving way. Steve flipped through the pages until he reached the back cover. He took out 3 photos from a flap inside. He leaned forward and placed the first photo on the coffee table in front of Barbara and her parents. When Barbara saw it, she flinched and shut her eyes. "Look, Lloyd." "Diane," Steve said in a businesslike tone, "this is my wife at a party at a mansion out in the county. She forgot to tell me about this event, but I figured out when it was." He glanced at Barbara. She wouldn't look at him. "She told me she was going shopping in Austin with 2 of her friends for the whole day," Steve explained to his in-laws. "I believed her," he added, sounding frustrated. Not sure if you noticed," Steve said sarcastically, "but Mr. Raphael Porter has his hand on my wife's waist. Doesn't seem right, does it?" Lloyd swallowed hard and shook his head, not believing what he saw. He looked at his daughter, but he didn't know what to say. "Well, so much for no touching, right?" Steve said brightly. "I guess Barbara forgot to tell you about that party, too?" He placed the second photo on the table next to the first one. "Now, here we are at that same party," Steve continued. "Remember when I asked Barbara about no kissing? This picture seems to go against that, wouldn't you say?" He leaned closer and pointed to the area around Barbara's and Porter's heads. "Can you see my wife with that guy? It's clear, isn't it? You have to wonder how she could forget to mention this, right?" The 3 on the couch were silent. Lydia scoffed, sitting on the love seat. Diane and Barbara looked angry at her, but Lydia wasn't worried. Steve placed the last photo on the coffee table and sat back down in his chair, leaving the photos in front of the others. "Now, this third one is quite interesting, isn't it?" Steve asked casually. "You can see how well my wife is helping Raphael with his problems, can't you? My goodness, Barbara, you must be doing wonders for him. He looks pretty happy in this picture, wouldn't you agree?" Steve's voice was getting sharper. He tried to stay calm. "No!" Barbara shouted. He wasn't doing anything wrong with me like that," she argued, "and I told him more than once to stop, but she stopped talking when she saw nobody wanted to listen." Steve said thoughtfully. "Barbara, Can you tell us why he thinks he can act this way towards you? What's going on that makes him feel he can do that? I really want to know." Barbara shook her head. "It's not what it looks like," she said. He... Barbara. Barbara, Lydia said from her seat. "You're not helping yourself here." "Mom!" Diane yelled. "You said you wouldn't get involved." She shot a glare at her mother. "Fine. Whatever," Lydia said with a wave of her hand. She leaned back, a look of mockery on her face. This gave Barbara a chance to gather herself. "Okay, I admit it," Barbara said boldly. "I should have made him stop, but look at those pictures. We were in a public place. It's not like we were meeting in a hotel or something." Her voice got softer as she realized she shouldn't lead to any misunderstandings. She remembered their time at the park by the river. There were no cameras there. "Steve, I'm sorry for how this looks," Barbara said sincerely. "But we don't need to get too worked up about it. You saw us at the park, right? We were just talking there. You saw that." Barbara was sure there was no proof. Steve had his doubts, but no solid evidence. "Really, Barbara?" Steve asked gently. "Nothing happened?" He picked up the remote from the table and turned on the TV, then he grabbed another remote for his camcorder. It was ready to play the tape. No one had noticed it sitting next to the cable box. Steve hadn't found anyone to make a DVD of the tape. He had software to do it, but he didn't have much experience. So he planned to use the camera to show the video now. He decided he would do just that. Staring hard at Barbara, he pressed the play button. On the big TV, the Thunderbird was already in the water, and the image bounced as Steve's truck backed up. The sound was clear and loud. The roar of the engine filled the quiet room until Steve turned the volume down. When the truck stopped, everyone heard a door slam. Steve walked into the room from the left and stepped away from the camera, moving close to the stream. Suddenly, Barbara fell out of the passenger window and splashed into the dark water. Following her, a man stumbled out of the driver's seat and joined her. Both of them were covered in mud and struggled to get to the shore. Barbara waved her arms as she tried to stay steady but lost her balance and fell into a deep part of the water. After a tough fight, she got back to shallower water. Turning around, she reached for something in the water, pulling her purse out and holding it up high. Steve paused the video and pressed rewind. "Pretty interesting film, right, Barbara?" Steve asked softly. He stopped rewinding when the counter on the screen showed the part he wanted. "You shouldn't have done that," Barbara said angrily. Seeing herself like that made her upset again. Nobody had the right to show her like that. She had been so scared the truck would drive them into the deep water and something bad would happen. She had never been that frightened before. She hadn't recognized Steve's vehicle yet. "You didn't have the right to do this," she said sharply. "Rafe and I weren't doing anything But she stopped talking when she realized Steve wasn't paying attention. He was focused on running the tape backward and adjusting it. Finally, he paused it at the frames he wanted. "Now here," he said, looking at Lloyd and Diane. "You can see Barbara's hand up in the air. Look at that." He pointed with a red laser pointer from his pocket at a blurry part of the screen. "Humph." Lydia made her thoughts known, unable to stay quiet. Steve glanced at her but wasn't sure if she was bothered by what was on screen, the picture quality, or his use of the laser. He shrugged and went back to the screen, rewinding again before pausing. "Now, here you can see my wife and Rafe in a close position," Steve said jokingly. The two figures in the T-Bird's back window had their arms around each other. "Oh, Barbara," Lloyd said, sounding disappointed. "Daddy!" his daughter cried, shocked. She was hoping for support from him, not a soft criticism. "Now," Steve continued, "as you can see, my wife kind of leans down and then comes back up." He described what was on the screen, making what they were watching clear. "There!" Steve exclaimed, stopping the video where Barbara held something white for a moment before tossing it forward. "See that?" Steve asked. No one replied. They had all seen it. He looked at Barbara. Her face was pale. They both knew what they were looking at. "What you just saw," Steve said, "was my wife throwing something towards the dashboard." He kept his eyes on Barbara, his voice harsh as he explained what was on the screen. He pressed a button to make the image bigger, zooming in until it was clear what Barbara held in her hand. He didn't say a word. Barbara started to quietly cry on the couch. Releasing the pause, Steve played the tape forward to the moment Barbara turned around to grab her purse from the water. He stopped it when she was bent over, reaching in. I guess Barbara didn't realize her skirt was pulled up that high when she got out of the car. He left it at that. The video clearly showed her skirt hiked up. Steve pressed play again, letting the video run for a few seconds. "Here, we have a front view," Steve said, as if explaining to tourists. "Notice that my wife's shirt was not properly fastened that day." He paused again. Barbara's shirt was wet and stuck to her body. Steve said nothing more. He rewound the tape once more, halting on the moment when another person was climbing out of the car window. Steve turned off the camera without saying anything. It didn't seem needed. "So, Barbara," Steve said, "you weren't acting inappropriately, huh?" Lloyd had his head in his hands, unable to watch. Diane cleared her throat, unsure what to say. "I didn't do anything with him," Barbara said, her voice broken. "I didn't... Well, not this time anyway," Steve replied coldly. "I didn't give you the chance, did I?" he said with disdain. "Stop trying to convince me and everyone else. You went to the park with this guy. You took off your things for him and you were about to cross a line. You would have if I hadn't been there." He watched Barbara cry for a while. Her mother didn't know what to do at first. After some time, she put her arms around Barbara and gently patted her back as Barbara sobbed. "I never did anything with him," Barbara whispered. "I might have that day. I was confused. I didn't really want to, but he said it would be okay. I didn't want to do anything with him." She took deep breaths and shrugged off her mother's arms. "You caught me, Steve," Barbara said more firmly. "You won't believe it, but I'm glad you did. I was getting involved in something I really didn't want to be part of, and—" Steve's loud and dismissive snort interrupted her. "I didn't," Barbara insisted. "How many times did you go too far with him?" Steve asked. His voice was harsh. Barbara shook her head quickly. "I told you, I never did," she said firmly. "That's not true," Steve shot back. "That man was acting inappropriately, and you were hardly dressed. That doesn't happen on a first date." "How many times were you with him?" Steve asked again. Barbara shook her head. "How many?" Steve demanded a third time. Barbara didn't look at him, but shook her head once more. Steve," Lloyd said carefully. "Listen, they really didn't go that far. You made sure of that, right? The other pictures aren't great, but it's not like they were crossing any serious lines at that party either. Can't we all take a step back and figure this out?" He looked at Steve with hope. "Steve," he continued, "couples have worked through things like this before. You and Barbara can, too," he suggested. Steve stared at his father-in-law without showing any emotion. "Lloyd," he finally said, "you're acting like Barbara did something small. You think if she just says sorry, everything will be fine again. But she isn't a little girl anymore, and she can't fix this marriage just by saying sorry." Steve stood up and paced between the TV and the chair for a bit. "Look, Lloyd, she's been dishonest, telling me she was going places she wasn't, saying she wasn't doing anything wrong. She even lied to you, Lloyd. You're her father, and she told you bold lies. I tell you, I'm starting to think our whole marriage has been a lie from the start." He paced again. "Did you make up some kind of story to tell Elaine Porter?" he asked suddenly, surprising Barbara. "No. What?" she said, a bit confused. "Who's—" She stopped before she finished her question. "You really should check things out before getting involved with someone else, Barbara. Elaine, for your information, is Mrs. Porter, her husband." Steve paused for a second. "I wonder what their daughter will think of her father now," he said quietly. Barbara slumped and started crying again. Steve waited. He wasn't moved by her tears now. They would have hurt him before, but not this time. "Now you care?" Steve asked. He didn't wait for a reply. The pause in her crying let him ask his next question. "Okay. What did he tell his wife about being with a married woman?" Steve asked mockingly. "I don't know," Barbara said defensively. "I haven't talked to him since the day you saw us." "You haven't talked to him?" Steve asked, not believing her. "You haven't seen him? You haven't called him? You haven't texted him? You haven't emailed him?" Barbara shook her head firmly. Steve went back to the chair and took out a sheet of paper from the binder. He walked quickly to the table near the front door, peered into Barbara's purse, and pulled out her phone. "Hey!" Barbara shouted, feeling desperate. "You can't do that! You can't just go through my stuff and— Shut up! Steve yelled, cutting her off. You lost all your rights to privacy in my house when you decided to cheat on me. The look in Steve's eyes made her sit back down and drop her head into her hands. She started crying again. Now, let's see. Okay. Steve looked at the paper he took from the binder from the private investigators. He walked over to his father-in-law. See this, Lloyd? He said, showing Barbara's father the phone screen. This is Barbara's call list. It shows the last few calls. I forget how many. You see those at the top? You can see 4, but if you scroll down, yeah, there are a lot of calls to just a couple of numbers, right? Well, these first 4 are Raphael Porter's cell number, and those 2 calls are to his home phone. The next 3 are for his office. Well, you can see what's happening, right? All of these were made yesterday except the top 2. Barbara made those calls this morning. Heck, Lloyd, she called him just half an hour before you came over. She just told us 30 seconds ago she hadn't talked to him since the day I found them together, and it was all just more lies. Steve snapped the phone shut and tossed it toward the front door. Do you really think I can ever trust this woman again, Lloyd? Steve asked. His father-in-law just lowered his head. He was biting his lip. There was nothing he could say that mattered. Steve, Barbara said in a flat voice, please, I made a bad mistake, but I can fix it. I promise I won't talk to him again. I won't. Steve didn't look at her. Steve, I care about you. Please think about what's happening here. Don't overreact. Please, sweetheart. Overreact? Steve said in disbelief. Overreact? My wife has been talking to another man and I'm not supposed to overreact? He yelled the last word, suddenly furious at her attempts to downplay what she had done. Steve turned away. He didn't want to do something he would regret later. Barbara's quiet voice came from behind him. Please. I know you are upset now, she said softly, but I will never do this again, she begged. Please, Steve, let me come home and I promise I'll— You don't live here anymore, Steve said, cutting her off. A fire sparked in Barbara's eyes. This is just as much my house as it is yours, she shot back. Her mom and dad looked ready to jump back into the argument. Steve glanced over to where Lydia was sitting quietly. Did you ever tell them? He asked. Lydia shook her head. I never thought it would matter, she replied. What do you mean? Denise asked, looking at her suspiciously. When Lydia gave me the title to this house, Steve said in a low voice, she only put my name on it. I didn't notice until a year after Barbara and I got married. Lydia never changed it, even when I asked. I own this house, not Barbara and me. Everyone in the room went quiet. Barbara and her parents stared at Lydia. Lydia didn't seem sorry at all. She just shrugged. Oh, well, she said without offering any more explanation. Mother, nonny. Lydia! The older woman stood up and walked toward the door. What's done is done, she said quickly. Nobody can change the past. All you can do is make the best of it and move on. I think we've all said what we came here to say, haven't we? Lydia asked the 3 of them. Lloyd nodded and got up. The 2 women, following Lloyd and Lydia's lead, stood up and walked slowly to the door. Lloyd looked back at Steve, half apologizing. He shook his head and went outside. Once they were off the porch, Steve shut the door firmly. He leaned against it. Move on? He whispered. No, I'm sorry, Lydia, but there's no moving on from this. Not this time. Chapter 3. Last week of June. The rest of the weekend was calm. Steve spent Sunday working on the back deck and cleaning the hot tub. It kept him busy, and that was a good thing. On Sunday evening, he took some of Barbara's things to her parents' house. They had forgotten to take anything with them on Saturday. Nobody was home, so he just left the boxes in the driveway by the garage. As he drove away, he thought he saw Lloyd's car, but he wasn't sure. He didn't care much. By Tuesday after the argument, Barbara's parents seemed to have gotten over the shock. Steve guessed this because the phone calls started again. Barbara called 3 times on Tuesday afternoon, and her parents called once each. Steve didn't answer Barbara, but he returned the calls from Lloyd and Diane. On Wednesday, he got even more calls, and by Thursday, he had 18 messages waiting for him. That was on top of a couple of messages on his cell phone, even though he had told them not to call him on that number. Most of the calls said Barbara was very sorry for hurting him, that he was making too much of the photos and videos, And couldn't he please forgive her so everyone could move on? Steve? "Hi, Lloyd," Steve said tiredly. He picked up his cell phone without checking the caller ID. He was too worn out and wouldn't have taken the call if he knew who it was. "Listen, Steve, have you thought about everything? Barbara is upset, and Diane and I were hoping you could sit down and talk with her soon." "No, Lloyd, I haven't had time to think. I've been dealing with a lot of problems at work, but it wouldn't have made a difference. The thing is, Barbara chose to be unfaithful, and this time it's final." "Aw, Steve," his father-in-law said sadly. "I was hoping you could find a way to get past this." Steve didn't say anything. He felt angry at the idea that he was being unreasonable but didn't want to say anything he might regret later. "No, Lloyd," Steve said carefully. "I won't get over this. I don't see why you think I should." "Think about it, Lloyd. How would you feel if Diane started seeing another man? Would you like to see your wife with someone else? Is that something you want to go through?" "No," Lloyd said after thinking for a moment. "I wouldn't like it, but if I stopped it before it became a problem, I think I would work with my wife on fixing things." Lloyd was quiet, and so was Steve. "Steve, don't you think you're overreacting a bit?" Lloyd finally asked quickly, not wanting to say the words but feeling he had to. Steve clenched his jaw and counted to 10, just like his mother taught him when he was a kid. Sometimes counting wasn't enough. "Lloyd," Steve said softly, "the next time I hear someone use the word overreacting, I might lose it. I'm just warning you so you can stay away when I do, sir." There was no response. "Look, Lloyd, I'm tired. It's been a long day and I need to sleep, so please don't call me again tonight, okay?" "Ah, sure, Steve. Sorry I didn't see how late it was. Get some sleep and have a good day tomorrow, all right?" "I will, Lloyd. Thanks. Good night." He was worn out but couldn't fall asleep. Overreacting. That word had been used a lot lately. After tossing and turning for 30 minutes, Steve got up and walked to the study. He turned on his computer and opened his email. Overreacting? He knew what he had seen. There was no overreacting to that. Barbara was still in touch with Mr. Porter, and that bothered him. Well, she had been on Saturday, and nothing had changed since then. He didn't have proof, but he felt in his gut that she was still talking to Porter and probably meeting him somewhere. He had a good plan to stop what was happening. He had been thinking about it for a week. He pulled out the 3-ring binder that the private detective agency had given him and turned to the right page. It took him 2 hours to carefully write down all the information by hand, but he was glad when he was done. He knew he would feel tired from losing sleep tomorrow, but tonight he felt it was worth it. Overreact? He laughed to himself. Let's see how people respond to this. She had been delivered shocking news when she left work yesterday afternoon, and it hit her hard. Seeing the legal documents asking for a divorce from Steve was something she hadn't expected. This morning, she felt sad, confused, and lost. She spent all night trying to understand how she ended up in this situation, but it was pointless. Her mind was so mixed up that she could hardly think. She had barely slept for a few hours. On her way to work, she noticed her car's gas tank was almost empty and had to stop at a gas station. She didn't want to risk running out of gas while the warning light flashed. Steve used to handle these things for her. It had been so long since she'd done this that she had to read the instructions just to use her credit card properly. Tired and confused, she didn't notice that she needed to take her card out quickly, which caused her to mess up the first few attempts. Then she realized she forgot to unlock the fueling door by pressing a button in the glove box. She hoped she wouldn't have to go through this again anytime soon. If only Steve would come to his senses, everything could go back to normal. After all, she hadn't really done anything wrong with Rafe. Rafe had been respectful and had promised to take things slowly. Still, she sometimes questioned if she would have chosen differently when Steve confronted Rafe that day. Rafe was still upset about the situation. He thought Steve had no reason to act so aggressively. It wasn't necessary, but he hadn't called the police or anything. All he had done that day in the park was reach for his phone to call for a tow truck. He talked about suing Steve, but as far as she knew, he hadn't done it yet. She felt confused about everything that had happened to her recently. She didn't know where her life was headed, and she had to deal with small tasks she usually didn't have to worry about. Her thoughts jumped all over the place, leaving her no time to rest on one topic long enough to think clearly. By the time she finally reached work, she was very stressed. She was late, which she hated. It always seemed to set a bad tone for her entire day. Nothing felt right lately. When she reached the 6th floor, it felt like everyone was staring at her. She was already sensitive about that, but today it felt worse. After Steve's actions last week, it seemed like people were watching her closely. It felt strange. Was someone still following her every move? "Hi, Barb," Tom said. He looked over her shoulder to see if someone was with her. "No one with you today?" he asked. His face seemed calm, but Barbara noticed something unusual in his eyes. "Hi, no, not today," she said, feeling puzzled. She turned to look back down the hallway and saw several other co-workers watching her. She didn't understand Tom's question, and was surprised to see a few people staring at her. Two of them, women she didn't get along with, had strange smiles on their faces. She gave Tom one last look before walking away. "Hello, Barb," Katie said. "You're all by yourself today?" Unlike Tom, Katie didn't stop to chat. She kept walking, tossing the comment over her shoulder. Barbara felt uneasy. Something strange was happening, and she didn't know what it was. Suddenly, June was beside her, urging her to follow her to her desk. "Come on, don't talk, just come," June said before Barbara could say anything. She didn't like being rushed. It didn't feel respectful. Her skirt was riding up, and she wished she had worn a longer one, but most of her longer skirts were still in boxes waiting to go to the dry cleaners. This skirt was one Rafe had bought for her. Usually she felt uncomfortable wearing it, but today was different. Sometimes, Rafe's suggestions felt overwhelming. June hurried Barbara into her tiny cubicle and made her sit at the computer. Taking a deep breath, June opened her email. "Barb, I don't know what's going on, but this email must have gone to everyone in the building." June clicked on a message with a scary subject line. "Have you seen this man and woman?" When it opened, June scrolled down so Barbara could read it. "Have you seen this man and woman? They are both cheating on their spouses and have been for a long time. If you see Barbara Curtis and Raphael Porter together, please call the number below to report when and where you saw them. All calls will be confidential." Barbara couldn't believe what she was reading. June scrolled down to show side-by-side pictures of her and Raphael. Underneath was the home phone number she had shared with Steve for the past 4 years. "Oh God, oh God, oh God," Barbara moaned. She felt lost and didn't know what to do. She looked up and saw Bill, tall and skinny, looking over the partition at her. He acted like he was looking around while checking a paper with information. He pretended to be sad that there was no one around except for June and Barbara, and slowly sat down. Barbara took her phone out of her bag and pressed the number for home. She fought back tears and looked at June with an apology as she waited for the call to connect. The phone rang. "Steve," she said softly. "Please pick up," she added impatiently. The phone rang twice more before Barbara heard 2 clicks as the answering machine started. "Hi, you have reached the infidelity hotline," Steve's voice said. Barbara recognized it right away. This time there was something cold in his tone. "If you have seen Raphael Porter with Barbara Curtis, please stay on the line. Your call is very important to us. At the beep, please tell us the date, time, location, and what you saw about these 2 people together. Remember, your information is completely anonymous. No one will come to your home. Thank you." Barbara heard a loud beep in her ear. She knew the machine was recording, but her mind went blank. She had no words. She hung up and pressed another number on her speed dial. She needed to talk to someone else and waited anxiously for someone to answer. "Daddy?" she asked sadly. Steve heard the phone ringing but chose to ignore it. He had already received 28 calls, most of which were just jokes with no real information. A few were nasty, asking why he could not keep his wife from leaving him. Those bothered him. He wondered how callers thought a man could watch a woman 24 hours a day and still have a life. These calls frustrated him, but they were so silly he let them go quickly. When the answering machine picked up the latest call, he stopped typing on his laptop to listen for a moment. The voice sounded soft and tired. There was a lot of hidden emotion in it, like the person was trying hard not to fall apart. "Is anyone there?" she asked. After a brief pause, she added, I'm calling about the email. I don't know what is going on," she whispered. "Please, I need to know." Steve felt a chill run down his back. He suddenly knew who was on the other end. He picked up the phone. "Mrs. Porter?" he said softly. "Yes. Who is this?" she replied, her voice rough. "I'm Steve Curtis," he said. "I'm sorry for how you found out about this, Mrs. Porter." He wanted to say more. He felt bad for not thinking about her before sending the email, but all he had focused on was telling the truth. "Is it true?" she whispered. "You've seen them together, or something?" Steve took a deep breath and sat back in his chair. "Yes, ma'am," he said gently. "I have photos from a party a few weeks ago and a video from when I saw them at City View Park last week." "The park? But that's where my husband's car got wrecked in a hit and run," she said. Steve scoffed. "No, ma'am, I just talked to him there." She was silent for a long time. "Can I see the pictures or the video?" she asked, her voice softer. Steve didn't like how weak it sounded. "Yes, Mrs. Porter, you can see them. Do you have an email address I can send some pictures to?" She gave him her business email. She checked it often from home and got emails from the store's server. Steve sent the photos. A few seconds later, he heard a sound that told him she had a new email. She put the phone down and he heard quick mouse clicks. There was silence for a moment before he heard her quietly crying. He felt sorry. He questioned his reasons for sending out that email. Listening to her cry hit him hard. "Mrs. Porter?" he said, hoping to get her attention so he could say sorry again. "Mrs. Porter?" "Yes, I'm here," she whispered. "I'm sorry, Mr. Curtis. I've been worried for months. But it's still hard, when it's something you can't ignore," she said. There was a brief pause. Steve felt unsure if he should talk or not. He wanted to, but he didn't know how to help Elaine Porter feel better. "Mr. Curtis?" she asked. Her voice was a bit stronger now. "Yes, ma'am," he answered. "What about the video? You said there was a video." "Yeah, I have about 10 minutes of footage from the park," he said. "Can I see it?" she asked softly. "Sure. Do you mean tonight?" he asked hesitantly. "Well, I don't have to, I guess," she said. "I don't want to bother you." "No, that's not what I meant," Steve replied. "I just wanted to make sure I understood you. We're in a tough situation, and I don't want to make it worse. I don't know what to say. I've never been in this kind of spot before." "That's fine, Mr. Curtis," she said after a short pause. "I feel the same way. I'm embarrassed about what my husband has done to your marriage, and I don't know what to say either." "Well, for one thing, ma'am, your husband and my wife are adults, and it takes two to make things happen, as my grandma used to say. My wife is the one who has changed our marriage, so don't feel bad. It wasn't you, Mrs. Porter." "Please, call me Elaine," she said, her voice more steady. "Sure, Elaine, I like that," he said. "And I'm Steve, okay?" They talked a little longer, mostly to figure out a place they both knew where they could meet and talk openly. In the end, they found a small cafe where both of them felt at ease. They met long after dinner time. The cafe was not busy yet, as it would only get crowded when the clubs closed later in the night. They had plenty of time to chat, and Steve showed her the video, still saved on his camera. He reminded himself that he needed to find someone to help him turn it into a DVD. Things got tense after the emails were sent. Calls from Lloyd, Diane, and Barbara were tough to handle. Barbara had taken a long leave from her job because she felt bullied and uncomfortable. Soon, she would have to go back to work or take time off without pay. She was upset about it and let everyone know in different ways for days. Lloyd and Diane kept asking him questions until he couldn't take it anymore and stopped answering calls from Barbara and her family. The only person he still talked to was Barbara's grandmother. "Hey, young man," Lydia said cheerfully. "How are you doing?" "Hi, Lydia. I'm good. How about you?" Steve replied. He had checked the caller ID carefully before answering, but he was happy to take her call. "Pretty good for an old woman," Lydia said with a laugh. It was one of her favorite lines. Steve chuckled. He loved how her tone changed each time she said it. "I'm glad to hear it," he said warmly. They talked about small things and big things for a while before Lydia got to the main point. "Well, you've sure caused a stir in the Montgomery house, haven't you?" she said directly. Steve shrugged. "I know, Lydia," he replied. "Some of it was my fault, and some was just part of the job." "You had to do what you did, I think," Lydia said. Steve was surprised. "You're the first to say that," he said. "I don't think Lloyd and Diane agree." "They don't, but I don't let that bother me," Lydia answered. "It was clear to me that Barbara wasn't going to change her mind without a push. I don't mean she was dating him or anything, but from what she said, I'm sure he told her you were being unfair and that it was wrong to kick her out. I wanted to tell her off so bad I was about to burst, Lydia said. Steve couldn't help but laugh. Lydia was always straightforward. She never held back. Anyway, she continued after they stopped laughing, he called her a couple of days after your email and told her clearly that he didn't want to talk to her or hear from her anymore. I found out his wife is keeping him in check, Lydia said happily. How did Barbara take that? Steve asked after a pause. She didn't like it at all, Lydia said with a giggle. Her dad and Diane have been giving her a hard time every day. She thought Rafe was her only friend, and when he left, she was all alone with her thoughts, and she didn't like what she was hearing even then. Steve didn't know what to say. Well, they didn't say that to me, he replied. If I heard it once, I heard it a dozen times about how I should save the marriage, how I was making things worse, how sorry Barbara was, and all that. Yeah, I know, Lydia said kindly. I had the bad luck to hear some of those calls, but what they say to you and what they say to her are two different things. He thought about what Lydia was telling him. Well, they have to support Barbara, of course, he said wisely. She's their daughter, and it makes sense. Yep, Lydia agreed. But guess who is her best friend now, huh? Steve took a moment to think. Oh, he finally said. Lydia began humming a tune from an old TV show where answers had to be given quickly. He could almost hear a ticking clock in his head. Me, he guessed. Definitely. Lydia laughed. So now I get to talk to you and pass messages from your wife and chat with both of you. Her voice changed suddenly. I think that will be great, don't you? Steve laughed. Lydia was from South Texas but had been educated in the best schools, so she could sound very classy when she wanted to. Her switch in how she spoke surprised some people, but it fascinated Steve. Well, I don't have any messages for her today, Lydia, he said, still laughing. But she has one for you, Lydia said quickly. Steve went quiet. What is it? He asked flatly. Don't you be using that tone with me, young man, Lydia replied, returning to her South Texas accent. That's not nice. Steve sighed. I'm sorry, Lydia, he said. I don't mind your way of talking, but you're poking at something that hurts, you know? I always said you were smart, Lydia said after a moment. No judgment was in her voice. Some people think you're quiet, but I see that you like to watch others make fools of themselves. She was silent for a while. Steve, you and Barbara would be a great couple if you could work together, and I won't stop hoping to see that until I've tried everything I can think of. You hear me, young man? I hear you, Lydia, Steve said seriously. But I think it's pointless. Your granddaughter has hurt me too much, and I can't build a life with someone who would do that. I understand, son, Lydia replied gently. I know. Steve? She asked after a long pause. Yeah, I'm here. I just didn't know what to say, Lydia. Well, I'll hang up now so you can get back to your work, she said, but I needed to ask you something first. This is about the message from Barbara I told you. Okay, go ahead, Steve answered calmly. There was no harm in hearing what Barbara wanted to say. Steve, what do you think about seeing a counselor? Someone who could help you talk things out with Barbara without pushing you too hard? How do you feel about that? No way, Steve said right away. It won't help, Lydia. Barb and I just don't see eye to eye on too many things, and it won't work. Would you think about it, Steve? Lydia prompted. They talked for a few more minutes. Lydia asked him again and again to consider going to counseling, but Steve always said no matter how she put it. Lydia finally stopped asking, but she made Steve promise to call her now and then just to chat. Steve agreed. Chapter 4. Late July. He hadn't seen his wife for 6 weeks, not since their argument that Saturday afternoon. He wasn't looking forward to meeting her now. He really didn't want to be in a counselor's office with her. It felt pointless. 3 days earlier, he had been called to the CFO's office. Willis Johnson was the chief financial officer, but he was really the one in charge of important decisions. He had been friends with the owner of the company for over 60 years. When Mr. Johnson spoke, everyone listened. The meeting was friendly enough, but a clear message came through. The company thought Steve's upcoming promotion to district supervisor was a good choice, and they wanted him to take the job when the current supervisor retired next fall. However, They believed that a person in a stressful job like his should have a supportive spouse. That was what Mr. Johnson said. He quickly brushed over why the company cared about his personal life. He seemed a bit uncomfortable while explaining. The main point was that it was almost a requirement for his new job that Steve try to go to counseling. They seemed to hope Steve would fix things with his wife, but they didn't say that outright. Steve didn't even know that upper management knew about his divorce. The meeting left him feeling uneasy. It seemed Mr. Johnson felt the same way. Still, here he was. On a Thursday evening he would rather spend watching college football. He sat across from his wife in the small waiting room while they waited for the counselor to come back. Barbara tried to talk to him, but Steve just replied with shrugs or short answers. Then the door swung open, and a short, round man in a shirt hurried in. He was older, with a red face and a ring of white hair around a bald head. He moved quickly toward the inner office where his desk was. Sorry, he called out. Traffic is bad tonight. Come on in. Let's get started. He opened the office door wide and went inside. Steve blinked, shrugged, and got up to follow him in. He didn't look at Barbara. The man's name was Verna Houston. He was not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. He had graduated from a certified counseling school in Austin and had been doing family counseling for 26 years. He stayed up to date with the latest information in his field. In fact, that was why he was late. He had been at a class. He was happy to see them and apologized again for being late. He talked quickly, wanting to finish the small talk and get to the main reason they were there. After he said everything he needed to, he looked at them closely. What do you each want to achieve through counseling, Mrs. Curtis? The sudden question surprised Barbara. Well, I want to reconcile with my husband so we can move forward in our lives, she stammered. I see, Houston responded. What do you mean by moving forward? Why is there a problem? He asked thoughtfully. Barbara's face turned red as she looked away, focusing on the curtain rod near the window. Steve caught me in City View Park with a man I know, she finally admitted. He thinks something inappropriate happened. Why would your husband think that? Barbara avoided looking at Mr. Houston. She stared at anything else but him or her husband. Because we were just sitting in his car and... Oh, I don't know. Her words faded away. She lifted her hands in a strange way, then dropped them back into her lap. Steve watched Mr. Houston closely. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Barbara's hands move. He noticed Mr. Houston glance at the movement and then back to Barbara. A slight frown appeared on the therapist's face. Steve suddenly thought that Mr. Houston seemed to understand more than he let on. Houston was a very good observer. He could read people's body language as easily as most people read a comic book. Don't forget to mention the details you left out, okay, dear? Steve tried to join the conversation. Barbara shot him a quick look. You'll have your turn, Mr. Curtis, Houston said briskly, without any emotion. Please go on, Mrs. Curtis. I didn't mean to do anything wrong, Barbara said. I was confused. I don't even know why I went with him that day, but I wouldn't have done anything bad. It was just a mistake. A mistake? Mr. Houston repeated, looking at Barbara until she answered. Yes, she paused. I'm sure. I wouldn't have made any bad choices, she said firmly. Houston waited for her to say more. When she didn't, he turned to Steve. What are your goals for family counseling, Mr. Curtis? He asked. Steve was ready for this question. I have two goals, one short-term and one long-term, he said. First, in the short term, I want my wife to tell her lawyer to stop making things difficult in the divorce process. Second, I want to move on with my life. That's my long-term goal. He didn't add anything else and looked directly at Mr. Houston. You don't seem to think your marriage to Barbara can get past this problem, do you? Mr. Houston asked. There is no hope, Steve replied. Then why are you here? The counselor asked. Because my job is making me come, Steve said plainly. Mr. Houston nodded. Okay, as long as you don't come in here angry and yelling, we'll handle that, Houston replied. I won't promise anything, Steve said coolly. He kept looking at the counselor, showing no sign that he wanted to cooperate. Houston's face didn't change, but his eyes looked a little sadder than before. Barbara says she made a bad mistake, he said. What does that mean to you? Nope, I'm not playing that game. It wasn't a mistake, Steve replied strongly. A mistake is when you dial a wrong number. That's not what happened. She chose to get in that man's car and made choices that led to this situation, Steve said passionately. He forced himself to sit back in his chair. And it wasn't the first time, Steve added. You need to know that she isn't honest when telling the truth would be better for her. She told her parents lies about why I kicked her out, and I had to show them proof before the truth came out. Is that how it happened when you met with your parents, Mrs. Curtis? Asked Mr. Houston. And her grandmother, Steve interrupted. And your grandmother? Houston added. Barbara fidgeted in her chair. She wouldn't look Houston in the eye. Yeah, that's pretty much it, she mumbled. I see, Mr. Houston said in a flat tone. He looked between Steve and Barbara. Suddenly, he sat up in his chair and rested his elbows on his desk. Mr. Curtis, Mrs. Curtis, I see my role here as helping you both talk about your disagreement in a safe place where you can speak freely. I don't know you, and I won't have dinner with you. I won't call to chat on a Sunday. Houston gently interrupted. Let's make sure one person speaks at a time. Barbara, please go on. Barbara took a deep breath to gather her thoughts. I realize now that I should have been more open with Steve about how I felt. I never meant to make him feel betrayed, but I understand why he would. Mr. Houston nodded. Communication is very important. Steve, how do you feel about what Barbara just shared? Steve crossed his arms, thinking carefully. It's frustrating to find out there were things I didn't know. I just want to understand why things went this way. That's a fair concern, Mr. Houston agreed. It's important to share your feelings, but also to listen. You both need to feel safe to share your thoughts without worrying about being judged. Barbara looked at Steve. I want us to move forward. I don't want to stay stuck in the past. Agreed, Steve replied after a moment. But we need to work on rebuilding trust. Absolutely, Mr. Houston said. Trust takes time to rebuild. It might help to discuss how you both can take small steps in your daily lives to restore that trust. As they kept talking, it was clear that both Barbara and Steve were willing to try to work through their problems. They left the session feeling hopeful about healing their relationship. Houston raised a hand to pause their talk. Let's take a moment to think about what we've just discussed, he said calmly. It's important that both of you feel heard here. Barbara took a deep breath and glanced at Steve, looking a mix of frustrated and sad. Steve, she began softly, I do love you. Yes, I made a mistake, but that doesn't define our whole relationship. I want us to move past this together. She hesitated, searching for the right words. I feel like you're only seeing the worst parts without looking at the whole situation. It's not fair to think of me as someone who would betray you completely. Mr. Houston nodded, encouraging her to go on. Steve, I understand your feelings, but this wasn't what it seemed. I want to rebuild trust and communicate better, she explained. I really hope we can work through this, Barbara said. Steve crossed his arms and looked away for a moment. I feel hurt. It's not just one thing, it's a pattern, he said, his voice steady but full of feeling. I want to feel safe and appreciated in this relationship. Mr. Houston stepped in, saying, It seems like both of you have feelings that need to be talked about. If you want to move forward, rebuilding trust is key. Barbara nodded, looking at Steve with serious eyes. I really want that, Steve. I want to show you that I care about our marriage. Steve looked at Barbara with doubt in his eyes. I want that too, but we both have to try. We need to be open and honest to heal, he said. Then let's discuss how we can communicate better, Mr. Houston suggested. What can you both do to make sure your needs are met? They continued talking, looking for ways to strengthen their bond and understand each other better. Mr. Houston started to ask Barbara to listen while Steve spoke, but Steve turned to his wife too quickly. Thad Brown, when we were dating, he said firmly, holding up his right forefinger. I saw you with him just a week after we decided to be exclusive, Steve said. I didn't see anything wrong, but when you broke a date with me to meet your old boyfriend, it worried me. We were apart for about 6 months after that, Steve said to the counselor. Then there was Jimmy. What's his last name? Last year before Christmas, Steve said, turning back to Barbara and raising his middle finger to join the first. I didn't see anything wrong, but you two were laughing and looking at each other while I was right there. His voice was sharp. I'm still hurt by how you disrespected me that night, and I'm not sure I'll ever get past it. After that, you defended him when we talked about it. You picked his side against yours. Steve raised a hand to stop Mr. Houston when he tried to speak. "This isn't new to her, Mr. Houston," Steve said. "I don't often shout, but I will stress my point," he added. "Now for the third one, Rafe Porter," he said, adding his ring finger to the others. "Now I have proof you were close with him. I saw clear signs of affection at least twice," Steve continued. His voice was firm and steady. "That's 3 times I know you've betrayed me or our marriage. Barbara, this has become a habit for you. No more. 3 strikes and you're out," he said strongly. He turned back to the counselor. "Do you want to know what the real problem is? My wife promised to love, honor, and respect me when we got married. She promised to stay faithful, and she has broken all of those promises. My wife has betrayed me and our marriage. She lies, cheats, and puts others before me, and I won't put up with it anymore. I should never have taken her back after she hurt me in college." "How foolish of me," Steve said bitterly. "I loved her, and I thought she loved me." He leaned close to his wife, his face inches from hers. "But don't worry, dear," he said with a mocking tone. "I'm learning not to love you. It gets a bit easier each day." His voice was intense. Barbara flinched at the strength of his words. "I don't trust you," Steve said. "In my opinion, you're a liar, and I can't believe anything you say. When you say you weren't with that person at the park, I think you're lying. Everything shows you were there. And I don't believe you when you say you weren't with him either," Steve continued. "I have a photo that shows you in a bad situation at that gathering. I don't know if you think I'm foolish, Barbara, or if you really are. People don't act that way in the beginning. It's clear there were more feelings there than you're saying." "I feel like you're not honest at all," Steve went on. "Don't tell me you want to just move on. What you want is to sweep this under the rug and act like it never happened. That won't work this time." He frowned. "What was it you said? Oh, I'm making too much of this. Something like that? You, your dad, your mom, and maybe your grandma too, have all been saying I'm overreacting. I'm tired of that term. I'm reacting to your lies, your betrayal, your deceit, and your disrespect. That's not overreacting. That's just facing who and what you are." Steve took a deep breath, let it out, and sat back in his chair. Strange enough, he felt better than he had in weeks. Maybe talking about his problems with a neutral person was a good idea. Now, Barbara didn't have her family around to defend her all the time. "That's all," Steve said calmly to the counselor. There was a long pause. "Okay, we understand where we are," Mr. Houston finally said. "I think it's a good time to stop for tonight. We will have individual sessions next week and another meeting next Thursday. I'd like both of you to think about what your partner has brought up and how you can address those issues." "Wait," Barbara protested. "What about me?" she asked, upset. "Don't I get a chance to talk?" "You already had your chance, Mrs. Curtis," the counselor said softly. "You talked about the biggest issue in your relationship, and Steve shared his thoughts too. Now, the best thing you can do is try to fix the problem for each other. You don't need to defend your views. It is enough that you both see these important issues. We must work on resolving these problems before we can tackle the other issues bothering you both." "Honestly," Steve said, "if you're not going to be real, then don't say anything at all." This made Barbara angry. Her eyes flared with annoyance. "Of course, Mr. Curtis," the counselor responded calmly. "We need honesty to solve what bothers each of you, right?" Steve nodded firmly. Barbara didn't like how Mr. Houston seemed on Steve's side, but she felt she couldn't say anything without looking foolish. She reluctantly agreed. "What's that? What about a Christmas party?" Lydia asked sharply. Barbara was sitting in a comfortable chair in her grandmother's living room while Lydia sat on a big sofa nearby. Barbara had been spending more time with her noni lately. Her dad was slowly supporting Steve more, which confused Barbara. Dad was supposed to be on her side, not siding with someone else. Mom also seemed worried. She kept asking why Barbara had been at a fundraiser with a guy named Porter. She seemed surprised that Barbara had spent time with him at the city park. Barbara hoped her grandma would understand her side better. There was no one else to talk to this Friday afternoon. Her sister Kim had said rude things and told Barbara that she hoped Steve would leave her. Kim believed Barbara didn't deserve someone like Steve. That left Barbara feeling very uneasy. She had never faced such serious issues without her family's support. "What? Oh, The party, Barbara replied. Well, Steve and I went to the Christmas party for my work. He thought I was paying too much attention to Jimmy Roberts. I wasn't, but Steve thought so. Then Steve got upset about a joke Jimmy told me and made a big scene. Can you believe that? Jimmy was Mr. Reynolds' nephew. He was important at the firm, and Steve was rude to him. Lydia thought about her granddaughter's story for a moment. She asked what the joke was and frowned when Barbara explained. Finally, Lydia stood up and moved the big ottoman closer to Barbara's chair. So, tell me, were you and this Jimmy close together? Lydia asked. Oh, yes, Barbara admitted. But he was the boss's nephew, right? Lydia sniffed at that, but let it go. Okay, were you and Jimmy talking? How did he end up next to you anyway? Wasn't he with someone? Well, I don't think he had a date or anything, Barbara replied. I'm not sure, she said, sounding slightly surprised. Jimmy sat by me when he came into the big room. There wasn't anything strange about that. Jimmy and I had lunch a lot, and he sat next to me then, too. No one said anything about that, Barbara added. Uh-huh. So were you talking closely together? No, Barbara said quickly. Well, sometimes. But just talking, you know? Lydia sighed and moved the ottoman closer. So he was like this. She leaned toward Barbara, resting her arm close to her. Right? Well, yeah, but... And he told you jokes that only you two laughed at? Oh, I guess, Barbara replied, sounding annoyed. You're making it seem like a big deal, and it really wasn't. And sometimes Jimmy would talk softly, like he was only talking to you because you were special? As she asked this, Lydia lowered her voice and leaned in. Her fingers brushed against Barbara's arm. Barbara leaned closer to hear her grandmother better without thinking. When she realized, she blushed. Noni! She pulled away from her grandmother. Lydia chuckled, but her laugh didn't have much joy in it. If you had pulled back when Jimmy was acting flirtatious, Steve wouldn't have gotten so mad, Lydia said. But he wasn't doing that. Barbara stopped herself, becoming thoughtful. Lydia let the quiet grow for a moment. Oh, man, Barbara finally said. He was, wasn't he? Oh, definitely, Lydia replied quickly. And he thought he could get away with it right in front of your husband, too. Where do you think he got that idea from, huh? Barbara didn't answer. Here's a thought, Lydia said cheerfully. Maybe it was because you had lunch with him all the time. Maybe it was because you laughed at his jokes. Maybe because you two liked to talk softly so only you could hear. It wasn't anyone else's business. Maybe you said a few things about Steve. Maybe he upset you or didn't do what you wanted. Maybe Jimmy thought Steve was some kind of joke as a man, someone who wasn't as smart as he thought he was. And you too? Did you think you were part of that group, but your husband wasn't? Barbara looked sadly at her grandmother. Noni, she said quietly. I promise I would never do anything wrong with Jimmy Roberts. I wouldn't ever. But you already did something that wasn't right, Lydia interrupted. The first time you told Jimmy anything bad about Steve, you hurt your husband. You did it again when you began meeting Jimmy for lunch, or happy hour, or dinner, Barbara said, shaking her head quickly at the idea that she had dinner with him. Thank goodness for small favors. Okay, but the first time you laughed when Jimmy said Steve wasn't smart enough to get a joke, you really hurt him, honey. But it was just a joke, Barbara replied, almost crying. It got blown out of proportion. It wasn't just a joke, Barbara, Lydia said firmly. Jimmy was trying to corner you, to keep you away from others, especially from your husband. You let him think he had a good chance. Barbara looked at her grandmother, shocked by what she heard. But Noni, it wasn't like that. It wasn't serious. Steve just misunderstood, and he didn't need to react the way he did. Lydia frowned. Barbara, she said softly, when Jimmy said Steve wasn't smart enough to get that joke, why didn't you tell him your husband was just hours away from getting his engineering degree? Why didn't that pop into your mind? Why didn't you stand up for Steve when he was put down, instead of siding with Jimmy? Barbara looked down, feeling helpless. She frowned as she tried to think of something to say to show her grandmother she was wrong. No words came to her. Honey, you need to sort things out fast, Lydia told Barbara briskly. She stood up from the ottoman and pushed it back in place. You don't think that was serious? In my day, if I had done something like that, my husband would have confronted him right away. That thought made Lydia sad. It reminded her of her husband. He had left for a fishing trip 7 years ago and never returned. They found him a week later by the river, still holding an old photo of her. She missed him a lot. Lydia looked down at her granddaughter. Also, every man at the table would have supported him in dealing with any man acting inappropriately around his wife, Lydia added. Listen carefully, Barbara. I love you, but you need to get yourself together, or you'll lose your man. I know Steve. He won't tolerate what you're doing. Barbara looked up at her grandmother, feeling hurt. She had never heard such harsh words from her noni before. She had no reply. Chapter 5. Early September. This isn't helping, Steve said with frustration. We've been in counseling for 5 weeks and we're going in circles. He was trying to focus on Mr. Houston and ignoring Barbara as much as he could. But I told you. I see now that I shouldn't have met with Chad. Even if it was just to say goodbye, Barbara argued. I realize it was wrong, but I can't change it now. And I was wrong to let Jimmy get so close, she added. I thought he was just being friendly when you weren't around. Steve stayed quiet, watching her. He understood her words, but they didn't mean anything to him. He shook his head tiredly. I don't understand what you're saying, Steve said. When was I ever not nice to you? Well, you wanted to go to that guy's house for Thanksgiving, she said, feeling resentful. You made me go, and I already promised my parents we would be there, and I had to call and tell them we were going somewhere else. No, I didn't, Steve replied quickly. Remember? We agreed we had spent 3 Thanksgivings at your mom's. We thought it would be good to do something different. Maybe have dinner at someone else's house and visit your mom afterward. Barbara looked at him, unsure. A memory started to come back. Well, maybe you're right, she said reluctantly. But when we got there, it was a messy little house, and that guy's quiet wife, and the messy little house was clean inside and out. It needed paint, but they didn't have the money for that. Not a big deal. That guy Greg saved my life 5 years ago when a heavy beam fell while being lifted 9 stories high. It would have crushed me, Steve explained quietly. I owe him everything, and he won't accept anything in return. Barbara stared at her husband, surprised. She hadn't known. And his quiet wife has a name. It's Tanya. When they were teens in Texas, she defended her boyfriend against a rabid dog for 15 minutes while he couldn't fight back. Greg had fallen and hit his head, and Tanya fought the dog off with just a stick until Greg could get up. Steve leaned in closer to Barbara. Tanya loves her husband. They have been together since 6th grade. She couldn't do to Greg what you've done to me. Just thinking about it would wreck her. I feel jealous even thinking about Greg. Steve straightened up, looking straight ahead, his jaw tight. Okay, you're right, I guess, Barbara said tiredly. I do remember we agreed to go to their house. It's just that when Jimmy started flirting with me, I felt like you were pulling away and not listening to me, she said. Steve looked at her with surprise. For Barbara, this was a big step. And what about Raphael, the Thunderbird man Porter? He asked with sarcasm. Barbara was ready for that question. You left me alone for that long trip, she replied. I needed you with me, but you weren't here. She stood her ground. Rafe came into the building to handle some issues with an accountant and saw me upset outside the restroom. I didn't expect things to become so messy. All I wanted was someone to talk to, and he was there. Steve looked into his wife's eyes. She looked back without wavering. I had to go on that trip, Steve said firmly. We talked about it, and I don't go on business trips often. That was the only one this year. How could you need me so much that you turned to another man so quickly? We were getting along better right before that. How could you do that? It just happened, Barbara replied after a pause. I didn't plan it. I didn't want it. It just happened. Steve turned away in frustration. I know when someone is making excuses, Barbara, he said. You're supposed to answer my questions honestly. That's what we agreed on. We promised to be truthful and— I had a miscarriage, Barbara shouted. Both men stared at her in shock. What? Steve asked, confused. What do you mean? While you were away, Barbara said flatly. 3 days after you left, I started bleeding and had to go to the hospital. I didn't know I was pregnant. She waved her hands helplessly. Steve's mind spun. Barbara had lost a baby? He hadn't known. She said she wasn't aware she was even pregnant. But how could you go to the hospital with something that serious and not tell anyone? How long were you there? Steve asked. A week, maybe more. More than a week? But why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you call? I would have come home right away, Steve said, his voice showing worry and confusion. I didn't tell anyone, Barbara said softly. Not even Mom or Dad. I only called them at night when it was quiet in the hospital. When I got home, it was easy to act like I just needed some time alone. I wanted to sleep. I couldn't eat. I lost 20 pounds. You noticed when you got back. Why? Steve demanded. Why did you hide it from me? Why keep something so important from me? Barbara opened her mouth, but no words came out. She realized she didn't have an answer. I don't know, she finally said, her voice heavy. Tears suddenly filled her eyes and ran down her cheeks. Oh, God, she cried. I lost my baby. I lost my baby. Steve instinctively turned to his wife. He almost stood up to hold her, but then he hesitated. He remembered all the other times she had made excuses in their counseling sessions. He made himself stay seated. This didn't change anything. So, last week we talked about your miscarriage, Barbara, Mr. Houston said quietly. The session had ended abruptly when Barbara couldn't continue talking. Barbara nodded at the counselor. She seemed steadier than she had in a while. She faced Steve directly. Steve, she said softly, I'm so sorry I hid this from you. Mr. Houston and I talked about it in our individual sessions, but I still don't know why I did it. I felt ashamed. I thought it was my fault because I didn't even know I was pregnant. I can't explain why I felt that way or why I couldn't share my pain with you. I just couldn't. Someday, when I understand it better, I'll tell you why, but right now, I just don't know. Steve looked at her. She met his gaze without looking away. He decided that for once she was telling the truth. He shrugged. Okay, you'll tell me, he said simply. Since you're being honest today, maybe you can share another secret, he said. Anything, Barbara replied. How many times did you see Raphael Porter? Steve asked. Barbara looked away. I never had any interactions with him like that, she said. You're lying, Steve said, and you're not very good at hiding it. He turned to the counselor. I'm done for tonight, he said calmly. Until my wife is ready to tell me the truth, there's no point in talking. He stood up and walked out without another word. How many times? Steve asked again. Tonight, 2 weeks later, Barbara had promised she wouldn't dodge his questions. It was a condition for Steve to return to couples counseling. If she lied again, he was ready to leave. October was just around the corner and nothing was getting better. Barbara took a deep breath. Twice, she said quickly. But it wasn't what you think, she added. Steve slumped in his chair. He rolled his eyes in disbelief. Suddenly, he jumped up and walked quickly to the window by Mr. Houston's desk. Pulling on the cord to raise the blinds, he stared wildly outside, pressing his cheek to the glass to look up into the sky. He shook his head, rushed to the window behind Mr. Houston, and did the same. Mr. Houston watched, professional and calm. He wondered if he would need to pull Steve back if he tried to jump out of the window. Steve was a big guy. I don't see it, Barb, Steve complained. Maybe it's not coming tonight, you think? Mr. Houston cleared his throat gently. Ah, what isn't coming tonight, Mr. Curtis? He asked kindly. The mothership, of course, Steve replied. My wife has obviously been taken by aliens who think differently than we do. That's what she said, right? Her alien friends were supposed to pick her up soon, but without the big ship in sight, it looked like it wouldn't be tonight after all. Steve sat back down, enjoying his little joke. Mr. Houston wasn't laughing, though. Steve caught a brief smile on his face before a blind fell down and hid Verna's reflection. Mr. Houston lowered the other blind and sat down again. Barbara didn't say anything while Steve was acting silly. She just turned red, and the color crept up her neck to her ears. Can I continue? She asked Mr. Houston, who nodded. Go right ahead, Steve chimed in. Barbara shot him a distracted look. This was hard for her. Steve's teasing went over her head because she was focused on what she needed to say. What I meant was, Mr. Porter only wanted me to help him, Barbara said quietly, looking at the floor, not wanting to see anyone's face. And I only helped him through his pants, she added. I never really touched him. Steve stayed quiet, watching his wife. Barbara's face turned even redder as she stared at the corner of Mr. Houston's desk. Suddenly, Steve snorted in disbelief. If that's true, then you must be the saddest cheater ever, he said. And Raphael must have no skills if that's all he got from you. All that sneaking around, all those lies, and he got just a few mild moments? That's really pathetic, he said with disgust. Barbara wouldn't look at him. No way, I just don't believe you, Steve insisted. You're trying to trick me again, you're lying. That made Barbara turn to him quickly. It's true, she yelled back. Her cheeks burned because of his harsh words. Again, she looked away. Steve saw this as more avoiding. He shook his head and got up. I'll come back when she's ready to be honest, he said to Mr. Houston. I have better things to do than waste time with a liar and a cheat. He left the room, closing the door softly behind him. So you told Steve you were really with that Porter guy? Lydia asked. Yeah, Barbara said, upset. But he didn't believe me. He said it was pathetic. Lydia chuckled, but she stopped herself out of respect for her granddaughter. Still, she partly agreed with Steve. Well, sweetie, it's not the most exciting story I've heard, Lydia said. She noticed Barbara's face turning red. You really need to accept this. Whatever you did with that man, you shouldn't have done it. You had no right to share anything like that with anyone but your husband. But Noni, it wasn't like that. I did all of that in high school, and... Barbara stopped, feeling awkward. She didn't usually talk about these things with her grandma. A smirk crept onto Lydia's lips before she could stop it. Barbara, let me ask you this. If Steve was right over there, Lydia pointed to the couch, and this Porter guy was in front of you, would you feel okay doing anything wrong in front of him? Lydia watched keenly as Barbara's cheeks flushed. Of course not, Barbara protested. Lydia nodded. She waited as it looked like Barbara was thinking deeply. Okay, would you let Rafe get too friendly with you? Would you have done any of that with your husband watching? Barbara's face went from red to pale in just a heartbeat. She closed her eyes. No, she said softly. Lydia let the silence last for a moment. Her granddaughter was finally confronting something she had avoided for a while. Do you see why Steve is upset about how you've been acting? Lydia asked gently. Barbie, honey, if you can't do it in front of your husband, then it's wrong. Barbara's face twisted into a pained expression. Oh, I guess I've known this all along, Barbara said tiredly. But it sounds so horrible when you say it, Noni. It was awful, Lydia said firmly. It was the most shameful thing I've ever heard you do, Barbara. How could you let something like that happen? Didn't you think about how it would hurt Steve? But, Noni, it felt like it didn't involve Steve. I wasn't thinking about us. Barbara paused, her face showing her frustration. I don't know how to explain it. It felt like I was in another world around Rafe, and it didn't seem real. I didn't see it as being tied to my marriage. I see now it was wrong, but I just wasn't thinking about what might happen when I was with him. Everything with Rafe was just about that moment, nothing else. Barbara said, reflecting on her feelings. I don't understand why I was like that, Noni, she asked her grandmother, confused. Do you really want to know why? Lydia asked. Barbara nodded, her eyes filling with tears. Then you need to be open with Verna Houston. Don't try to cover anything up, okay? Just tell him how you felt and answer all his questions sincerely. That's the only way you can get help, understand? Barbara nodded. Lydia squeezed her arms around her granddaughter. It's going to be okay, Barbie. It will be okay. No matter what, you'll get through this. But Noni, I don't think Steve loves me anymore, Barbara cried. I don't know what to do. Barbara cried on her grandmother's shoulder for a long time. Lydia gently patted her back until she calmed down a bit. Do you love Steve? Lydia asked. Barbara nodded. Lydia felt her granddaughter's movement. You know Steve doesn't feel the same way, Lydia said. He doesn't see how you could love him after what has happened. Barbara sighed. I know, but I never stopped loving him, Barbara said with strong emotion. I made some mistakes, but I never wanted to hurt him. I thought he would never find out. I'm so confused, Noni, she said as tears started to fill her eyes again. But you still love Steve and want to stay with him? Lydia asked, not letting herself be distracted by the tears. Wait, don't answer right away. Think about it for a moment. Your husband doesn't love you right now, and he might not ever love you again. Are you ready to face that? Barbara took a moment to think about what her grandmother said. Noni, she said softly, wiping her eyes with a tissue. I made mistakes, But I know Steve is the best thing that has ever happened to me. I've always known it. I want him to love me again like he did before, and I'll do anything to make that happen." "That's not going to happen," Lydia said firmly. "What do you mean?" "Sweetheart, you're not the same person he married. He was in love with the woman he married. He doesn't love who you are now. He doesn't even know who you are anymore. You've changed your marriage in a way that has hurt it. Steve is angry right now, and he might not change anytime soon. Can you deal with that, dear? Can you handle the cruel words and rudeness he's going to show you until he gets it all out of his system? Can you—" Barbara thought carefully about what her grandmother said. She understood the challenge in Lydia's question. She nodded with determination. "I want my husband back," she said strongly. "I want him back so badly I will do anything to show him I'm his woman, and I won't make a fool of myself again." She glanced out the window at the children playing across the street for a moment. "But what do I do, Noni?" she asked. "If he doesn't love me anymore, what do I do?" Lydia chuckled. "Why, that's the simplest thing ever, dear. You make him fall in love with you again, that's what. Monday. Individual counseling session, total honesty. That's the key," Mr. Houston said firmly. "I cannot stress this enough, Barbara. If there is any chance of fixing things with Steve, he needs to see that you are open and honest. No hiding the truth, no softening the facts, no shame." Mr. Houston felt frustrated with Barbara. It was the 3rd week of September, almost 2 months into their couple's counseling, and she had only just admitted there were problems in her marriage. This was another session with Mrs. Curtis. He wished she had brought this up sooner. "I have to say, you're coming to this discussion pretty late," he told her. "Your husband is probably very upset, and I doubt he would trust you right now." "I know, Mr. Houston," Barbara replied quietly. "I've been foolish, and I see that now. I thought things would go away if I just ignored my mistakes. I was ashamed of what I did, so I hid it. But my grandmother has talked to me a lot, and I now understand I was being silly and selfish. I'm sorry for that, and I will also apologize to Steve when I see him." The counselor leaned back and looked at her for a while. Finally, he sighed. There was no doubt Barbara was sincere. She seemed calm today. Her eyes were steady, and she looked right at him. Her hands were still in her lap, not twisted or fidgeting around like before. He hoped they could work things out. "Okay, Barbara. I warn you, for a long time ahead, you might think Steve is paying me to challenge you when I talk to you. You may not like me. You may not enjoy it when I speak. We've tried to take it slow, but that's over now. From now on, I won't let you avoid issues or dodge questions. I won't hold back anymore, do you understand? There won't be any nice words or covering things up with gentle ideas. That's too late now." Barbara nodded. "I know I'm late, but I hope it's not too late," she said softly. "We'll have to see," Mr. Houston replied in a calm tone. "Now, let's get to it. Mrs. Curtis, no good counselor will disagree with what I'm about to say. I warn you, it won't be easy to hear, but you must understand it. Not just hear it. You must truly accept it." Barbara nodded. "Okay, Barbara. I need you to see that from Steve's point of view, what you've done is very hurtful to him. He feels, even though he's never told me this, like you took something good and turned it into something that causes him pain. He can't stand feeling this way. He's struggling with the situation and the marriage. He feels lost. Steve believes you've been stepping away from the marriage, and he feels like he's in competition. He thought all competition ended when he married you. He had every right to think that way. A wife is not meant to put her husband in constant comparison with others. A husband will always feel that he loses that battle, Barbara. Even worse, he doesn't understand what he did wrong. He's been trying to figure out what led you to your choices, but can't see anything important, and that troubles him. He started to doubt himself because he kept thinking about where he might have let you down." The counselor turned away from the sadness on Barbara's face. He thought he understood what Steve was feeling because he had been through something similar before. However, he also understood how Barbara felt. It was his job to watch people and figure out their emotions just by looking at their faces and movements. He could see the hurt in Barbara as she realized how her actions hurt her husband. "Mr. Houston?" Barbara said softly. "Yes," he replied. "Would it help if I showed Steve that I only interacted with Rafe Porter 2 times? Would that help him feel a bit more stable? Enough to build on?" "Maybe," he said slowly. But Barbara, I doubt he would believe that. Mr. Houston, I just want to find a way to move forward. I feel like I'm stuck in a loop. The counselor nodded, recognizing the frustration in Steve's voice. It's important to move forward, Steve, but we also need to face these feelings and experiences. Sometimes recognizing them is the first step toward healing, Mr. Houston said gently. Steve sighed and shifted in his chair. I understand that, but it's hard to keep going when I feel like I'm just going in circles. I don't want to stay stuck in the past. Then let's think about what comes next, the counselor encouraged. What are some goals you have for yourself beyond this situation? Steve thought for a moment, his face showing deep thought. I want to feel like myself again. I want to get back to the things and people that make me happy. That's a good start. Let's talk about those interests, Mr. Houston said as he took some notes. What things have you always enjoyed? Well, I used to love hiking and traveling, Steve said, sounding a bit more excited. I haven't done either in a long time. Great. Those are wonderful ways to find yourself again. Let's discuss how you can bring those activities back into your life, the counselor suggested, happy to see Steve's mood change. Steve nodded, a faint smile appearing. Yeah, I think that could really help. Let's make a plan, Mr. Houston said, leaning in a bit closer, ready to work together toward renewal. Mr. Houston, I feel frustrated a lot, sad almost to the point of being overwhelmed sometimes, resentful all the time, and I have totally accepted that I might divorce my wife. I won't argue with her or anyone else for any reason. The counselor's face became serious as Steve spoke. When trust is broken, there's only a short time to help a hurt partner and a regretful partner find their way to save the relationship. Mr. Houston worried that Steve and Barbara might have already missed that chance. It didn't seem hopeful. Steve was firm in his feelings and showed no sign of changing. Houston sighed, feeling disappointed. He realized he had been doing that a lot lately and knew he needed to work on it. How about we talk about trust, Steve? Mr. Houston asked quietly. Steve shrugged. What's there to talk about? He said. I'm not the one being dishonest. I haven't told you or Barbara anything untrue since this started. Well, what if I could show you proof that Barbara was telling the truth? Steve looked interested, a little doubtful but curious. How? He asked. Barbara asked me on Monday to set up a lie detector test. I work part-time as a counselor for the sheriff's department, which also works with the FBI. I made a few calls, and a friend of a friend came by my office this morning. Steve, the test showed that there was no dishonesty when asking her about her story. Steve thought for a moment, his face giving nothing away. You could have fooled me, Steve said finally. It's hard to believe what she said is true, but if that's what the machine said, I guess I can accept it. But if you think that changes anything, I can't see how, Steve said after a pause. The truth is, she was in a situation that hurt me deeply. This is the third time it's happened. I got past the first two. You won't find anyone who would say I should have forgiven her even twice. I was foolish to do that, but I won't make that mistake again. She told the truth. Finally, I admit, Houston said. She promised me on Monday to tell the truth and not to hide anything. Steve's lips pressed tightly together. It would have been much better if she had promised to tell me the truth from the start, right? Steve said bitterly. I believe she did that last Thursday, Steve. It just needed a little proof, shall we say? Steve shrugged in agreement. It's a start, Steve, Mr. Houston said. He carefully kept any plea out of his voice. If he didn't, Steve would notice and respond negatively. That would mean no hope. Steve, you and Barbara have 3 very painful, damaging events in your relationship that we need to address. But that leaves a lot of time in the early years of your marriage after you got back together, doesn't it? Steve nodded briefly. Steve, do you really want to waste those years if there's even a small chance you and Barbara can find a way to be together again? Steve looked at the counselor with a frown. So you're trying to negotiate with me, right, Mr. Houston? He asked. You think it's a good idea to stop ignoring all my feelings? Mr. Houston thought about what Steve had said. Yes, that's it, he replied. Have you practiced that speech? He asked suspiciously. No, Steve said. The last couple of years I've had to speak in front of some important people in the city and state, along with my own bosses. I've learned to handle things pretty well. He paused. Okay, he added. What do you mean? The counselor asked. I've gotten used to coming here for individual counseling and listening to my wife every Thursday night, Steve explained. I'll keep it up for a while, but there will come a day when it won't seem worth it anymore. Do you understand me, Mr. Houston? I understand perfectly, Mr. Curtis. If you're willing to keep coming, there's still hope. But Steve, when you come, I will ask you to get involved. If you're not willing to do that, then don't come to the sessions. He looked at his client for a moment. I think we understand each other? I think we do, yes, Steve replied. Thursday, couples counseling. Steve, I want to say I'm sorry. I mean it. I have hurt you, I have lied to you, and I have not been honest with you for a long time, and I will always feel bad about that. I know you can't accept that right now. I know I've pushed you away too much. I've been saying let's move on, but I haven't understood what I've done to you and to our marriage. I'm sorry for that too. It took this big mess to make me see that I can't be selfish anymore. I can't expect to always get my way while others ignore their own needs. The session had gone on for nearly 30 minutes. Steve had asked Barbara a lot of questions, and he was surprised at how well she answered them without pausing much. Some things she really couldn't remember, and she said so. She reminded Steve that she hadn't been keeping any notes, and some moments had not made a strong enough impression on her to recall later. Steve accepted that, but asked her to try to remember and let him know later. Barbara wrote down notes and promised she would. For the first time, she talked about the day Steve caught her with Porter. She explained that she had been feeling rebellious and made choices that she later regretted. It was the situation and the company that made her choice wrong. She confessed that while she hadn't meant to do anything wrong that day, she probably would have if the moment happened again. She admitted that she had felt excited and knew there were risks in what she was doing. When Rafe came close to her, she knew she could have gotten caught up in that moment. She had been angry and then shocked when she saw it was Steve who had walked in. It had been a shocking moment for her, forcing her to face the truth of what she had done and what it meant for her life. How do you fix a broken egg? Steve added. Barbara said she couldn't. All she could do was find a way to not break the other eggs in the carton. Her honest answer made Steve quiet for a while. She didn't know why she let herself get involved with Porter. She felt lost and lonely after the miscarriage. She felt alone and hurt because she had no one to talk to, but she didn't know why she felt that way. She planned to figure it out by going to counseling with a psychologist. Whatever she learned, she would share with Steve whether they were together or not. As for why she let someone get so close to her, why she made excuses for her behavior, and why she changed her values to justify them, she didn't know those answers yet, but she would share them when she figured them out. The only thing she knew was that she had felt much less confident after losing the baby and had felt unattractive because of the weight loss. Someone had complimented her and listened to her, and one thing led to another over several months. I wouldn't listen to you, Steve interrupted. Didn't I tell you how much I cared about you? Barbara took a deep breath and let it out before answering. It's silly of me, Steve. I know the truth is different, but I didn't think about it. I didn't work it out, but I felt like you had to say nice things because you were my husband. That doesn't make sense, Steve replied sharply. I know it doesn't, Barbara said calmly. At that time, I didn't think it through. I just accepted it. You're saying you messed up because someone said nice things to you? It's hard to understand. No, actually, Steve, 30 to 40% of people in situations like this act that way because of self-esteem issues, the counselor said quickly. He wanted to calm down the growing argument. Steve looked at Mr. Houston with anger. He accepted the man's knowledge, but it was tough to see this as a reason for someone's bad choices. Steve, Verna said softly, men and women often have different reasons for their actions. What makes sense to me and you as men doesn't always make sense to a woman. I'm not saying you would cheat on me because you're feeling low, but a woman might. Steve clenched his teeth in frustration. He wanted a reason, something he could grab onto and understand. He needed something solid to fix. This felt too vague. Steve, Barbara said in a sad voice, I don't know how to say how sorry I am. I know I've hurt you badly. What I did was wrong. I'm so ashamed of it that I can't bear it. I know you're in pain and I want to make it better, and... No! Steve cut her off. You have no idea what I'm feeling. You can't. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. "Before I met you," he said calmly, "I lived next to a young woman named Debbie. She had a terrible thing happen to her one night when she came home from the bar where she worked. I broke my ankle around that same time, so we ended up spending a lot of time together." Debbie explained that the emotional part of what happened to her was very hard. She talked about how it felt like someone had invaded her privacy. She felt that she lost her sense of self, the things that made her strong and confident. Someone had taken away what made her who she was. I told her I understood her pain, but I really didn't. Back then, I had no idea how little I knew about what she felt. She could tell I didn't fully understand, but I think she found some comfort in me since I seemed to care. He paused for a moment. "I didn't get it back then," Steve said again. "But now, I think I might understand a bit more, Barbara. What I'm feeling might connect to what she went through." He shrugged slightly. "But then again, maybe not. Our experiences are quite different, and I know that. But now I see her words in a new light. I understand her sense of loss much better now. I can tell you this. Debbie would understand what I'm feeling. She knows what it's like when your whole life changes in an instant. I feel like a part of me has been taken away, something deep inside that I can't get back. I don't know if I will ever feel whole again, Barbara. There's a heavy ache in my stomach and a cold feeling in my chest that won't go away. It hurts so badly. But I have to hold on to this pain, Barbara. It's the only thing I feel right now. If I let it go, I would feel empty." Steve stood up and walked slowly to the door. He turned to look at his wife and the counselor. "You don't know how I feel, Barbara. But maybe one day you will. Someday, someone might hurt you like I've been hurt, and then you will understand." He turned away and walked out the door, feeling much older than he really was. Hey listeners, if you enjoyed watching this video and want to stay updated with our latest content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss out on what's coming next. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video with Queen Cheating Tales.